Chapter 208. From beginning to end, from using the army to take back Yangshan Commandery to challenging me now, he wants to have the initiative at all times. He does not just want to fight me and Emperor Chun of Han, but the entire world. So if you want to form an alliance, then you, Yen, and Chu need to form a true alliance. Yenning stood up. His lips did not move, nor did the bystanders hear any sound. However, these 3 sentences clearly penetrated into the Qi Emperor's ears. The Emperor of Qi's face was solemn and shone with a strange light. He knew that this was not a normal warning, but Yen Ying's last words. Yenning standing up meant he was accepting the challenge. Emperor Chun of Han nodded in respect. Yenning nodded in return. The Yuanwu Emperor laughed. As he laughed, the peak of Deer Mountain was bathed in a strange light. There was nothing unusual about the blowing mountain wind and the drifting mist. Yet there seemed to be many rays of light that should not have appeared falling from the sky onto Deer Mountain. Everyone's gazes were heavy. This was true Realm 8, heaven opening. Another world seemed to have been opened in the sky. Countless energies that others could not sense rolled down. All of Deer Mountain was bathed in the strange light and seemed to turn into a bright and transparent gem. Dingming closed his eyes, not because of the light, but because of the pain he felt. The Yuanwu Emperor's cultivation had progressed much faster than he had imagined. This should have been impossible, but it had happened right in front of his eyes. In the teachings of any cultivation sect, the most important part of cultivation was to understand the flow of primal energies of the universe in one's body and in the surroundings. At this time, the Yuanwu Emperor started to open the sky. All the cultivators on the peak of Deer Mountain started to focus on comprehension in hopes of comprehending some important truths. But what they had not expected was that when their perception touched the primal energies of the universe that seemed to come from another world, they could only feel an enormous pressure, a pressure that seemed to crush everything. Even the Realm 7 experts present were no exception. Under such pressure, their consciousness became sluggish. A cultivator's consciousness was the source of everything. If one's consciousness slowed down, everything would slow down as well. None of the cultivators could comprehend anything related to cultivation from the Yuanwu Emperor's actions. They only felt that Deer Mountain had become a small world of its own under the Yuanwu Emperor's control of energy. This was a small world that belonged to the Yuanwu Emperor. When they thought of fighting in their opponent's little world, most of the cultivators on Deer Mountain grew paler and paler. They felt great terror. Even without fighting, it was enough to make a Realm 7 feel fear. This was the huge difference between Realm 8 and Realm 7. The 8th stage, Heaven Opening, was not only about communicating with heaven and earth, opening up a new channel for the flow of heaven and earth origin energy, obtaining even more boundless heaven and earth origin energy. At the same time, it was also opening up a small world that belonged to oneself. Emperor Chun of Han and Yen Ying, who were in the center of this pressure, naturally felt it more clearly than anyone else. However, Emperor Chun of Han, who had forgotten honor and disgrace, life and death, naturally did not feel any fear. Instead, he smiled and sat down cross-legged. Using his right hand as a sword, he stabbed towards the Yuanwu Emperor. When he sat down, red pill energy flooded out of his body. The red Dan Qi came from the heaven-stealing pill. The countless spirit herbs used to make the heaven-stealing pill were originally the condensation of astonishing Qi of heaven and earth. The Dan Qi of this kind of pill, which was made with the power of an entire dynasty, was exceptionally heavy and powerful. It was enough to fight against the Qi of heaven and earth, isolating him from this small world. So when he sat down, it was like a red boulder had been thrown into a pond. Regardless of whether he could match the small world outside, he had to first remain motionless. Red pill energy also shot out of his right index and middle fingers. Along with the red pill energy, there was also a wave of burning energy. This was the earth fire he had absorbed in his body after cultivating for a decade outside E Mountain. This was his life bond item. The pill energy was something that had been tempered by fire, with his body as the guide. The red pill energy and this beam of earth fire merged together, forming a crimson-red longsword. Boom! A furnace formed in the world. A terrifying wave of heat exploded in front of him, dispersing all the moisture around the peak of Deer Mountain. A furnace of the world formed when a sword appeared. In the minds of all cultivators, this was the unique mark of the Zhao sword furnace. Yet at this time, the killing intent and heat of Emperor Chun of Han's sword was many times stronger than Zhao Zhan's when he had fought Yi Sealing. Emperor Chun of Han sat cross-legged on the ground, holding the pill fire longsword between two fingers. He calmly and joyfully stabbed towards the Yuanwu Emperor's chest. Yan Ying, who was not far away from him, did not move at all. The black robe on his body swelled slightly, creating gusts of chilly wind. He was standing there motionlessly, but in the perception of everyone around, he seemed to become transparent air and disappeared in the bright light covering the peak of Deer Mountain. Unlike Emperor Qin of Han, who had turned into a boulder, this strongest grandmaster of the Qi dynasty seemed to have turned himself into a wisp of dark wind and hid himself in the Yuanwu Emperor's little world. Emperor Qin of Han's pill fire longsword moved through the air. Lines visible to the naked, I flashed across the tip and the sides of the sword. These were the invisible seal lines formed by the Yuanwu Emperor's consciousness and energy. Seemingly small but powerful energies were born and destroyed in these seal lines, forming shockwaves that could kill cultivators below Realm 4 and spread in all directions. This was likely the strongest attack the Yuanwu Emperor had encountered since he ascended the throne, and there was someone like Yanning who had not yet acted. But at this time, the Yuanwu Emperor still had his hands behind his back and looked up slightly at the sky. Boom! There seemed to be enormous thunder in the sky. Sound was a very slow thing in the world of cultivators, but when the enormous sound sounded, Emperor Qin of Han's sword had not reached the Yuanwu Emperor's chest. The vibrating sound passed through the bright threads of light, forming strange transparent swords that fell towards Emperor Qin of Han. Great Path Thunder Seal Sword. Ding Ning closed his eyes and said the name of the Yuanwu Emperor's sword in his mind. Emperor Qin of Han did not hesitate. He raised his pill fire longsword and slashed. It was not that he was slow, but that the Yuanwu Emperor was too fast. If he did not change, before his pill fire longsword reached the Yuanwu Emperor, his body would be cut to pieces by these seal swords. The pill fire sword turned into an enormous pill cauldron that spat fire into the sky. The transparent swords charged into the pill cauldron and gave off an enormous sound. The sound was loud and clear. All of Deer Mountain shook. All the peaks outside Deer Mountain shook. Many indescribable sounds appeared in the world. All the leaves on Deer Mountain left their branches and danced outwards. All the transparent swords shattered, but Emperor Qin of Han's body still seemed to be cut by shattered glass. Countless tears appeared on his leather robes, and streaks of blood appeared. Yanning looked calmly at Emperor Qin of Han and the Yuanwu Emperor. Only now did the fingers of his right hand move slightly. 5 wisps of black smoke lit up on his fingertips like the flame of a candle, quickly condensing into 5 round black pearls. These 5 black beads were connected by black threads, like a strange bracelet. The 5 black beads spun and flew up. They rubbed against the bright light and gave off strange and sharp sounds. But the black threads connecting the 5 black beads seemed to be absolutely still. The violent spinning of the 5 black beads seemed to have nothing to do with them. There was a cracking sound, and then it was suddenly silent. The 5 black beads disappeared under Yan Ying's fingers. 5 violently spinning balls of black light suddenly appeared around the Yuanwu emperor. Because the spinning speed surpassed the limits of ordinary people's perception, in the eyes of most people, these 5 balls of black light were round balls. However, some people could sense that within the 5 balls of black light, there were 5 black infants in different postures. These 5 infants gave off unimaginable dark winds. As they spun around the Yuanwu emperor. Stone grinding sword. The emperor of Chu sensed the meaning and said in disbelief. Not far behind the Yuanwu emperor, Huang Jinwei also widened his eyes in disbelief. He was sure that this was the true stone-grinding sword essence. The stone-grinding sword art was one of that person's creations and could not have been passed on. At this time, Yanning was clearly using the stone-grinding sword essence, but it was slightly different. He should have comprehended this sword essence from the battle traces left behind by that person, or even from the corpses that person had killed. To comprehend this kind of sword essence, one had to rely on talent. To comprehend the secret arts of another dynasty for one's own use, one needed humility and breadth of mind. Other than the emperor, who in the Qin dynasty could defeat this grandmaster alone, Huang Jinwei looked at Yan Ying's figure with a hint of respect in his eyes. The Yuanwu emperor frowned, slightly in displeasure. He raised his head even higher, as if he was looking up at the stars in the night sky. Multiple white streams of flame appeared in the sky, falling faster than the musical note swords. Chapter 209. The white flowing flame with a cold presence landed on the peak of Deer Mountain. Deer Mountain, which had been almost burned by Emperor Chun of Han's Pillfire Sword, suddenly became cool. Everyone felt comfortable, yet at the same time, everyone felt uncomfortable. The comfort came from their senses, but the discomfort came from the depths of their hearts. Everyone knew that this was the Starfire Comet Tail, sort of the Bazin Kendo ground. In the wars between the Qin dynasty and the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, many powerful cultivators had died under the Starfire Comet Tail, sort of the present Qin dynasty's empress. The Starfire Comet Tail sword was extremely fast, and its star energy was different from ordinary primal energies of the universe. Cultivators could not stop it with ordinary primal energies of the universe. Even more importantly, Zheng Xiu could cast the Starfire Comet Tail sword from a great distance, so that people on the battlefield could not detect her presence or the presence she gave off when she cast the sword. She could launch such an attack at any time when a powerful cultivator was at his weakest. So she would always be the most dangerous and poisonous thorn on the battlefield. Yet now, the Yuanwu emperor, who was realm 8, had comprehended the Bazin Kendo ground technique that only Zheng Xiu had comprehended before. In the future, when the dynasty fought the Qin dynasty, an even more dangerous and poisonous thorn would appear on the battlefield. Ding Ning had originally had his eyes closed, but before the star fell and appeared in front of everyone on the peak of Deer Mountain, he opened his eyes. His eyes reflected the white flames as if they were covered in a layer of frost. At this time, on Deer Mountain and the surrounding mountains, only he knew what the Yuanwu emperor was thinking. The Starfire Comet Tail sword was powerful, but it was not the best method to defeat the stone-grinding sword. With the appearance of the 9-death silkworm, all the nobility in Chongling speculated that that person had left behind an heir. Many cultivators in Chongling and even the other dynasties knew that Zheng Xiu had once been that person's lover and the strongest couple in the Qin dynasty. In the Yuanwu emperor's mind, he suspected that the disciple of that person was also around Deer Mountain and watching this battle. He even suspected that the stone-grinding sword technique had been passed on to Yan Ying by that person's disciple. Thus, he used the Starfire Comet Tail sword. Ding Ning's eyes reflected the white flames as if they were covered in frost. His lips curled into a sneer that no one else could see. "You're really bored, using the Starfire Comet Tail sword against the stone sword. Are you trying to show that you and Zhongxiu are very intimate and loving? It's a pity that Yan Ying's stone grinding sword was created by himself. What does it have to do with others?" He sneered in his heart. Several streaks of white sparks accurately pierced the black ball of light that was revolving around the Yuanwu Emperor. Multiple cracks appeared on the Yuanwu Emperor's dragon robe. In the next moment, his body exuded an extremely powerful aura. His body seemed to have suddenly grown in size, becoming incomparably huge. The 5 spinning black balls of light had been unable to stop the vital energy from coming out of his body after the Starfire Comet Tail sword's attack. But now, the Yuanwu Emperor's body seemed to grow enormous, and the 5 black balls of light were unable to resist. In everyone's perception, the 5 black balls of light were no longer 5 millstones, but 5 pitifully small pearls. Yanning was not fighting alone. When the Yuanwu Emperor completely defeated Yan Ying's stone-grinding sword essence, Emperor Qin of Han finally took a step forward. As he took this step, the ground and air in front of him started to burn, turning into a crimson world of fire. His pill fire sword was wrapped in small sparks that usually could not be seen. It passed through the curtain of fire and appeared in front of the Yuanwu Emperor's face. The Yuanwu Emperor knew that this sword was likely the strongest attack in the world other than himself. He raised an eyebrow, reached out with his left hand, and blocked this sword. At the same time, he used his right hand as a sword and stabbed at the curtain of fire in front of him with a bright yellow sword light. He used his hand to block the sword. His expression was so calm and cold that it seemed eerie. There was a loud crack. The presence of a life bond item came out of the Yuanwu Emperor's palm. A small cut appeared on his palm, and a few drops of blood flew out. The crimson red pill fire sword energy surged into his body through this wound. The eyes of many people who sensed this immediately lit up. Yet what caused them to stop breathing was that the Yuanwu Emperor's body was an unimaginably enormous vessel. The rolling pill fire sword energy charged into the Yuanwu Emperor's meridians. The Yuanwu Emperor only blushed slightly, but the pill fire sword energy entered deep into his body and disappeared to unknown places. His body was extremely stable, and his vital energy output was also extremely stable. The curtain of fire in front of him was completely pushed back by the sword light from his right hand. The bright, yellow jade-like sword light accurately pierced Emperor Qin of Han's chest and came out of Emperor Qin of Han's back. Emperor Qin of Han gave a muffled grunt and retreated. Many people immediately paled, especially the cultivators of the Chu dynasty, who could withstand the Yuanwu Emperor's sword through the body. In their view, Emperor Qin of Han would die in the next breath. With a bang, Emperor Qin of Han's feet landed on the ground. Countless cracks appeared on the hard stone ground of the mountain peak, like a newly formed spider web. Yet to everyone's shock, Emperor Qin of Han had not died, and his presence had not weakened much. No blood flowed out of the sword wounds on his chest and back, only red pill energy surging out like a fountain. The sword wounds did not expand because of the pill energy, but contracted. The Yuanwu Emperor looked at his palm. The wound on his palm was also shrinking, but not as fast as Emperor Qin of Han's wound. His brow furrowed slightly, and more coldness appeared in his dignified and deep eyes. The heaven-stealing pill is truly the strongest spirit pill in the world. He looked up again and said to Emperor Qin of Han. All the cultivators on the peak of Deer Mountain reacted. Emperor Qin of Han had not died because the medicinal power of the heaven-stealing pill was too astounding. The speed at which the medicinal power healed Emperor Qin of Han's body surpassed the speed at which his life was disappearing. At this time, Emperor Qin of Han likely had the most terrifying recovery ability in history. Yet they were even more shocked by the shrinking of the Yuanwu Emperor's wound. A Realm 8 body. A Realm 8 body actually possessed such terrifying recovery abilities. As the Yuanwu Emperor spoke, his body did not remain motionless, but moved strangely. Every time he swayed, there would be a patch of black light and a patch of bright flame flashing around his body. It was like a black shadow and a bright figure were chasing each other, but neither could truly touch the other. When the Yuanwu Emperor finished speaking, he seemed to have won enough time. Just as he raised his head, a majestic force from the sky suddenly landed on the peak of Deer Mountain. There was light, and the darkness had nowhere to hide. Yan Ying's figure appeared clearly in the light. A presence that was invincible to anyone present fell from the sky and landed on his body. Yan Ying's body kept on cracking. Black smoke seemed to come out of his skin due to an unstoppable power, as though he was about to burn. The Qi Emperor clenched his fists and could not help but stand up. But at this time, Yanning shook his head at him. The Qi Emperor's breathing stopped. He thought of what Yanning had said to him at the start. Yanning had told him to watch the show quietly and not do anything. He looked down and sat down. The Yuanwu Emperor's eyes narrowed slightly. More black smoke came out of Yan Ying's body, but it did not dissipate. In a short time, it formed a black pot around him and covered him, a pot that looked like an ordinary pot of black soil. The Yuanwu Emperor's left hand opened slightly. Powerful auras intertwined in the air, forming a giant talisman. Another invincible presence from the sky landed on the black pot. The surface of the black pot grew brighter, and a bright flame appeared. This time, it was truly burning. Yet, the black pot did not burn or melt. Under the calcination of such a flame, the surface of the black earth-like jar, which had no luster, emitted a ceramic luster, and even a bone-like luster. The Yan Emperor and many of the important officials of the Yan dynasty felt an indescribable feeling. A black pot like this had forced the Yan dynasty's army to retreat in the past. True shock appeared in the Yuanwu Emperor's eyes. This was a method that even he had never seen before and could not understand. Extreme yin gives birth to yang, the way of yin and yang transformation, the cycle of life and death. Yet, he was the strongest cultivator in the world at this time. In a flash, he sensed something. "Take my sword." He spoke and then reached out with his right hand. This was the first time he had truly attacked since the battle started. He attacked with his sword. As expected, you have cultivated it. At this time, Dingning took a deep breath and said coldly inside. Chapter 210. In his early years, the Yuanwu Emperor had cultivated the Phoenix-breaking sword manual. The phoenix was a legendary auspicious beast, and in the legends, it was almost immortal. The phoenix-breaking, in the name of the Phoenix-breaking sword manual, meant that even the phoenix could be killed in one blow. From this, one could imagine how destructive and murderous this sword manual was. The sword moves of this sword manual were especially righteous. Right now, many swordsmen of the Qin dynasty walked the pure path of light, and to a large extent, they worshipped the strongest emperor in the history of the Qin dynasty. But the Yuanwu Emperor went into seclusion to cultivate not long after his ascension. In these decades, no one had truly seen him use his sword. So after he reached Realm 8, no one knew if he still primarily cultivated the Phoenix-breaking sword manual. A bright yellow jade-like long sword appeared in the Yuanwu Emperor's hand. Then, he simply thrust his sword straight at the black jar that was enveloping Yanning. This sword appeared ordinary, Most of the cultivators on the peak of Deer Mountain did not even feel any powerful primal energies of the universe. Yet, the people with the highest cultivation present all shook and were shocked. Emperor Chen of Han knew that Yanning was at the most dangerous moment. With a soft cough, his feet left the ground. He flew up with the pill fire sword in his hand and stabbed towards the Yuanwu emperor. Some soft sounds came from in front of him. It was as if someone had thrown a stone from a very high flight of stairs, causing it to continuously roll down the stairs. The pill fire sword in his hand, which contained unimaginable power, suddenly stopped a few feet in front of him. A bright barrier appeared in front of him, preventing him from moving forward. A pill fire appeared in the air. Then a second, a third. Countless streaks of alchemy fire appeared in the air in front of him. It was like countless red flowers blooming on a wall. Many people on the peak of Deer Mountain sensed the dense turbulence in the air. They knew that in this moment, where their eyes could not see, Emperor Chen of Han had not just stabbed once, but countless times. Only with the support of the heaven-stealing pill could his meridians withstand such a high-speed explosion in such a short period of time. However, Emperor Chen of Han was still unable to stop the Yuanwu Emperor's sword. The bright barrier in front of him was the sword radiance of the Yuanwu Emperor's sword. What kind of sword art is this? Only then did cries of surprise ring out. Only now did many people see clearly that the Yuanwu Emperor's bright yellow sword contained countless strands of Yuan Qi flowing within. There were also countless rays of light flashing in the light barrier formed by his sword light. These energies and lights of varying strengths gave people the feeling that they came from completely different cultivators, or even not cultivators. However, the origin Qi and light all blended together, becoming the final sword force of the sword. The bright yellow sword in the Yuanwu Emperor's hand did not slow down at all. The tip of the sword stabbed straight into the black jar that was enveloping Yanning. The pill fire sword is not a true sword. As his sword stabbed into the black jar, the Yuanwu Emperor looked sympathetically at Emperor Chen of Han and said, "The sword itself is a sharp object. Other items are strong, but they do not have the piercing power of the sword. The sword was the leader of all weapons in ancient times. How can other weapons compare?" At the same time, a cracking sound was heard from the black jar. His bright yellow sword pierced through the black jar. The black jar shattered, and Yan Ying's figure appeared. The bright yellow sword continued to advance and stabbed into Yan Ying's body. Other than the Qi Emperor, this was the first time almost all the cultivators of the Qi dynasty were seeing Yanning. Yet everyone knew what Yanning meant to the Qi dynasty. The moment the sword pierced Yan Ying's body, all the Qi people present cried out in grief. There could not be a second heaven-stealing pill in the world. So there could not be a second person in the world who could withstand the Yuanwu Emperor's sword. Also, the Yuanwu Emperor's sword was much stronger than the one he had used to stab Emperor Chen of Han. Yan Ying's body flew backwards. The bright yellow sword left his body and gave off a cacophony of unpleasant sounds. No one knew if the sound came from the energies of the yellow sword or from the friction between the sword and Yan Ying's body. This sword had passed straight through Yan Ying's heart meridian and left a bowl-sized hole in his heart meridian. No one could survive such an injury. The sorrow in the hearts of the Qi grew, but Yan Ying's expression was still calm. He was not dead. Everyone's breathing suddenly stopped, not because of disbelief and nervousness, but because the air on the peak of Deer Mountain had become exceptionally cold. Because it was so cold, it felt like the dark corpse water in the deepest coffins of an ancient tomb. People did not dare to touch it, much less breathe it in. Shock appeared in the Yuanwu Emperor's eyes again. The appearance of the heaven-stealing elixir should have been Emperor Chen of Han, but in reality, from the moment he made his move until now, it was this Grand Master from the Qi who had caused his state of mind to waver. The extremely thick and cold energy came from Yan Ying's body. No blood flowed out of the bowl-sized hole in his heart meridian. His flesh and bones did not look like flesh and bones and reflected cold light. His heart meridian had completely disappeared under this sword. Naturally, his body could no longer beat and no blood flowed. At the same time, Yanning did not breathe. His body gave off a bone-chilling and cold presence. He seemed to have become the legendary undying zombie. As a Realm 8 cultivator, the Yuanwu Emperor knew that it was absurd for a person to truly die and become a zombie after their mind dissipated. As he put his sword in front of him, he frowned and said in a cold voice, "I had not expected the Mountainine sect to have such moves. I had not expected you to not want to live from the start." Yan Ying's voice sounded. An even thicker dark wind blew through the mountain peak. "I am still alive." The Emperor of Chu's expression was solemn as he slowly bowed towards Yanning. For an emperor, such a bow was extremely important, especially when he was not the emperor of the Qi dynasty, but the emperor of another dynasty. The Yuanwu Emperor and Yan Ying's conversation was profound and hard to understand. Most people on the peak of Deer Mountain could not understand, but some people still understood the meaning. Strictly speaking, Yanning was not a living being right now. The yin energy in his body had replaced the flow of blood. His entire body had become a pure vessel. To be able to make the yin energy replace the flow of blood and activate vital energy, he had to be unusually determined and had a consciousness that surpassed the fear of life and death. But without the nourishment of the body, this consciousness was like the mental power cultivators stored in their flying swords. It could only be used and could not be replenished. Even the strongest consciousness would slowly dissipate. Yanning knew that he was not a match for the Yuanwu Emperor, but he still showed enmity towards the Yuanwu Emperor. From the moment he showed enmity towards the Yuanwu Emperor, he had decided to use such a method. Regardless of whether he won or lost this battle, he was fated to die. But his resolve was enough to last until the battle between him and the Yuanwu Emperor was decided. Emperor Chen of Han was hard to kill because of the heaven-stealing pill. Adding on him, the Yuanwu Emperor's two opponents were like undying beings who had been given life. More and more people reacted. All the Qi cultivators who reacted still felt sorrow in their hearts, but at this time, their sorrows were solemn and moving. Ever since the Qin dynasty had fought against the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, the Yuanwu Emperor had always been hard to kill, because he always had the strongest group of cultivators in the world by his side. But those heaven-defying experts from the Bazin Kendo ground had all died. Emperor Chen of Han and Yan Ying's change was unprecedented, and the most likely chance to kill the Yuanwu Emperor. Yanning raised his arm and swung his palm towards the Yuanwu Emperor. The yin qi that had accumulated in his body burst out from his fingers and palms. Such an explosion of yin energy would normally be enough to kill him, but right now he did not need to worry about his body. The Yuanwu Emperor swung his sword. The bright yellow long sword and Yan Ying's palm met. Countless streams of aura burst out from the sword and palm, shooting out in all directions. The air was frozen by the beams, turning into grayish-black icicles. They fell to the ground and turned into streaks of black smoke, burning up. Then they turned into gusts of terrifying chilly wind. An unimaginable sword energy stabbed into Yan Ying's palm. Two of his fingers immediately broke off. His body gave off cracking sounds as his insides exploded. But his gaze grew colder. In his eyes, his two broken fingers did not fall to the ground, but sped up like flying swords and stabbed towards the Yuanwu Emperor's eyes. This time, there was an indescribable sense of indiscriminate destruction. There was an indescribable sense of tragedy. Chapter 211. Emperor Chen of Han shouted softly. The pill fire sword turned into a soft red chain and landed on the Yuanwu Emperor's yellow sword. The yellow sword sank slightly. Yen Ying's severed fingers were just a dozen feet away from the Yuanwu Emperor's eyes. At this time, the Yuanwu Emperor could not swing his sword to cut off these two severed fingers. Yet his expression grew serious. His eyes lit up and became the same yellow color as his sword. Pew! Pew! The two severed fingers stabbed into his eyes like flying swords and gave off two muffled sounds. Everyone was shocked, speechless. A ripple appeared in the Yuanwu Emperor's yellow eyes. The energy and power contained in the two severed fingers passed into his eyes and then disappeared. The two severed fingers that had lost all power instantly turned into ashes in front of his dignified eyes. Then they were swept away by the violent wind between the two of them and disappeared without a trace. This feeling was like the power of the two severed fingers had been swallowed by the Yuanwu Emperor's eyes. Universe Golden Body. The Emperor of Chu said. He finally confirmed what kind of vital energy method the Yuanwu Emperor mainly cultivated. At this time, the Yuanwu Emperor did not give off any blinding light, but in the eyes of the Emperor of Chu, it was exceptionally blinding and caused him to close his eyes in pain. The Emperor of Qi also closed his eyes in pain. After the Yuanwu Emperor ascended the throne, he had gone into seclusion. The cultivators of the world had made all kinds of guesses about the secrets of his cultivation and whether he had truly reached Realm 8. They all wanted to know some of the secrets of the Yuanwu Emperor's cultivation. Yet, as more secrets were revealed, the cultivators of the various dynasties found it increasingly difficult to bear. In the past, the strongest cultivators of Chongling mostly came from the Bazin Kendo ground. But the Universe Golden Body did not come from the Bazin Kendo ground, but the strongest secret method of the Yuhua family, one of the strongest old families in Chongling. It was rumored that after the Universe Golden Body was cultivated to the 7th level, not only could it allow the body to contain astonishing amounts of true essence, it could also contain powerful vital energy and power from the enemy. Only after the ancestor of the Yuhua Great Clan, who created this cultivation method, there was no one else who could successfully cultivate the Universe Golden Body above the 7th level. Unexpectedly, many years after the Yuhua family's reformation and destruction, the Yuanwu Emperor who had destroyed the Yuhua family succeeded in cultivating this secret method. The people of the Yuhua gentry might know the secrets of this secret method, but the Yuhua gentry had been destroyed long ago. Back then, no one had been able to escape. The cultivators of the present world could only guess, through Emperor Yuanwu's performance in this battle, what kind of person this method would turn a Realm 8 cultivator, who cultivated this method, into. Boom! A loud explosion was heard. The slightly heavy, bright, yellow longsword seemed to be surging with a shocking wave. The pill fire refinement that wrapped around his body was like a giant python that had its skeleton broken. It weakly scattered outwards. Dozens of energy waves shot out of Emperor Chen of Han's abdomen. Dozens of wounds appeared on his abdomen. His entire energy seemed to be about to explode. Due to the astounding effects of the heaven-stealing pill, he did not immediately die. The power contained in the pill fire was stronger than an ordinary Realm 7 sword. One of them even landed on Yen Ying's body and left a deep mark on his back. Yet, as he looked at Emperor Yuanwu, who appeared increasingly invincible and powerful as his cultivation and methods were revealed, his mind was still calm and determined. Victory did not depend on this. He and Emperor Chen of Han did not need to kill the Yuanwu Emperor directly. They only needed to exhaust the Yuanwu Emperor's power and deal enough damage to the Yuanwu Emperor. Thick black smoke gushed out of his face, as if a black baby mask was forming on his face. You are an interesting cultivator. At this time, the Yuanwu Emperor, who had pushed aside Emperor Chun of Han's Pillfire sword, did not immediately counterattack. Instead, he swung his sword forward. The yellow sword light only left behind a faint sword mark on the stone ground in front of him. But this sword mark became a mark with a mysterious power. Countless rays of light from the sky fell into this sword mark, forming a bright curtain of light that temporarily separated him from Emperor Chun of Han and Yanning. Then his eyebrows rose slightly. He looked in puzzlement at Yanning and said, "You are a Realm 7, but can fight a Realm 8. There were not many cultivators like you in the past, and there will not be many in the future. But this lonely one does not understand. This lonely one and the Chi cultivators do not have many grievances. Why do you dislike this lonely one so much?" Dislike that could cause a person to give up their life was an exceptionally strong emotion. The Yuan Wu Emperor did not think that a person like Yanning would be willing to fight to the death for the Qi dynasty to gain some benefits in the Deer Mountain Conference. Even if a person like you is going to die, you will only die because of your own love and hate. You will not die because of a city or hundreds of miles of flat land. So the Yuan Wu Emperor looked at Yanning and added, "You should tell this lonely one why." The cultivators who stood at the top were inhuman existences. From certain aspects, they had great eccentricities. This kind of thing was meaningless to many people, but was very meaningful to them. Hearing the Yuan Wu Emperor's question, Yan Ying's eyes showed disdain. "You ask me such a question? I heard that you do not like people with the surname Wang. In Chongling, almost everyone with the surname Wang is not important. Tell me why." At the words, the Yuan Wu Emperor's eyes narrowed slightly. The air on Deer Mountain seemed to be pushed out as though it was going to form a vacuum. "Is it not because of Wang Jingming? Is it not because you fear that person?" Yanning looked at the silent Yuan Wu Emperor and continued without hesitation. "It is laughable that you erased all the history books related to him because of your fear of him. It is laughable that the people of Chongling are so afraid of you that they do not dare to mention this name. But do they not still call him that person? Even that person seems to have become his unique pronoun." Yan Ying's voice echoed on the mountain peak. Thunder started to roar in the sky as though there were many enormous things moving through the sky that would charge down at any moment. In reality, most people here know that the Qin dynasty has its present glory mostly because of him and the people of the Bazin Kendo ground who followed him. You and Zheng Xiao are just shameless bandits who stole his credit. The disdain in Yan Ying's eyes grew. He said with disgust, "You should know that he is the strongest cultivator in Chongling. At that time, you were not as good as him. If he had lived until now, you would still not be a match for him. So for foreign cultivators like me, of course, he is the #1 enemy. In the 3 years before your ascension, which Grandmaster of the foreign dynasties did not think of him as their #1 enemy. He is the goal I pursue in my life. Defeating an enemy like this is my only goal in the past many years of cultivation. Yet he died due to shameless betrayal and schemes. Even more hateful, I found that I did not think highly of you and Zheng Xiao. All of a sudden, I no longer have an opponent. My many years of cultivation have suddenly become meaningless. The most important thing is that I don't think highly of you. An enemy who replaces him and appears in front of me doesn't even make me feel any respect. This is a boring and scary thing." Yan Ying continued to speak as he looked at the Yuan Wu Emperor. His reason was unacceptable to many people and even seemed a little absurd. However, everyone could hear the seriousness and solemnity in his voice. Everyone could hear that this was indeed his true thoughts. Before his death, I only felt enmity towards him. But after his death, I found that he had more and more areas worthy of respect. Liking someone requires many reasons. I do not like him very much, but I do not need many reasons to hate someone. Yening looked at the Yuanwu Emperor's increasingly emotionless eyes and said seriously, "So from the moment you ascended the throne, I decided to kill you." Because the Yuanwu Emperor had asked the question himself, he had been waiting for Yening to finish speaking. Then he said expressionlessly, "Only stubborn people can walk the furthest on a path. But no matter how many surprises you bring to this lonely one, you are still a fool. A person like you, who has a high chance of reaching realm 8, easily chooses life and death because of a moment of pleasure. You do not even know how to judge the situation. You are very stupid. Who in the world is not a fool? Won't all struggles return to the earth in the end?" Yening laughed. "You do not understand what it means to be happy at the moment. A person who does not even understand happiness will not be happy when they obtain the world." The Yuanwu Emperor took a deep breath and slowly said with an indescribable presence, "When I obtain the world, this lonely one will be happy." Yening glanced at him and said, "I fear that when you obtain the world, you will be about to die. Even in death, you will not be happy." His gaze was vicious, and so was his tone. Therefore, this sentence sounded like a curse at this moment. Chapter 2:12. The Yuanwu Emperor did not speak. His lips were pressed together like two thin swords. But Yening did not stop. He looked at the Yuanwu Emperor and said, "But you are a human and not a god. The universe gold body is wondrous, but it must follow the laws of the primal energies of the universe. It appears to be unaffected, but in the end, it is just opening a meridian point in the body to contain the enemy's killing intent and power. This killing intent and power exists in your meridian point and will not disappear for no reason. It will erupt one day." The peak of Deer Mountain grew even quieter. Everyone's gaze was complicated. These words were related to the secrets of the Yuanwu Emperor's cultivation, and they were spoken by a grandmaster like Yening. His tone was so certain, and there would be no mistake. The Yuanwu Emperor's eyes narrowed slightly like two thin swords. In his eyes, Emperor Chen of Han and Yening were not a match for him, but he could not continue to tangle with these two. "It is time to end this," he thought to himself. He slowly said this in his heart, and then raised the bright yellow sword in his hand again. For a powerful swordsman, sword essence was the best expression of their thoughts. The moment he raised his sword, everyone present understood that the moment of victory and defeat had arrived. Countless rays of bright light fell from the sky, surging into his body at a speed that surpassed the perception of all cultivators. The Yuanwu Emperor's body completely disappeared into the bright light, but everyone could sense that the Yuanwu Emperor's body was expanding and growing larger. In everyone's perception, the Yuanwu Emperor's body seemed to be as tall as the sky. Emperor Chen of Han knew that the final moment had arrived. He did not feel any fear, and had a kind of joy of release on his face. He took a deep breath. Using the pressure of the energy coming off of the Yuanwu Emperor, he gathered all of his pill energies deep into his body. His body seemed to shrink, and the red light on the surface of his body dissipated. His presence was withdrawn. His body floated forward towards the Yuanwu Emperor. At this time, the light around the Yuanwu Emperor gave off a domineering presence. The sword tip that stabbed out of the light had power that surpassed the comprehension of all cultivators. In their perception, it was approaching an ethereal heavenly path. This sword was like the power of the way of heaven. It was not something a human could stop. Just facing it was very difficult. But Emperor Chen of Han's eyes flashed with a demonic light. His entire body crashed into the tip of the sword. Through the light curtain, the Yuanwu Emperor glanced at Emperor Chen of Han. His sword-like brows furrow. He sensed what Emperor Chen of Han wanted to do, but this was his strongest moment. Even he himself did not have the power to change this illusory sword that was driven by all living beings. The bright yellow longsword in his hand, which did not seem to have the power of the mortal world, was swinging forward as he pleased. Dozens of feet away from the sword tip, hundreds of cracks appeared on Emperor Chun of Han's body. The air in front of the yellow sword seemed to be filled with countless transparent sword pieces that danced soundlessly. No core chi came out of the wounds on Emperor Chun of Han's body. In this moment, he turned his head and nodded with a smile to Yenning behind him. His body was sliced into countless pieces in that instant. The last emperor of a dynasty had completely vanished from the world in just a fraction of a second. However, there was an exceptionally blazing ball of crimson red pill light that collided with the bright yellow sword tip and then exploded violently. There was a loud explosion. The world shook. Everyone felt as though a mountain was pressing down. The cultivators closest to the battlefield spat out a mouthful of blood. The crimson alchemy fire surged out like a meteorite exploding. The dazzling fire made many people tear up. However, everyone forced themselves to keep their eyes open. They didn't want to miss a single scene at this moment. The Yuan-Wu Emperor felt as though an enormous mountain was pressing towards him. The yellow sword in his hand dimmed slightly, but as Emperor Chun of Han came to meet the sword, he sensed that the other was going to release all the power of the heaven-stealing pill in this attack. So he was absolutely calm. His presence shook slightly, and the sword in his hand slashed forward even more domineeringly. The exceptionally tyrannical pill fire was smoothly sliced apart like two solid hemispheres, separating from his sides and then turning into countless sputtering fire dragons. At this time, Yen Ying's left thumb bent slightly and flicked in the air. In the wild air, a dark and cold black sword light suddenly appeared. This black sword light was like a broken zither string that had flown out of nowhere. The sword essence was untraceable, and it accurately cut towards the Yuan-Wu Emperor's eyes. Previously, when he had faced the stab of the broken limb, the Yuan-Wu Emperor had not dodged at all. But now, the Yuan-Wu Emperor suddenly closed his eyes and bowed his head slightly. A soft sound came from the corner of his left eyebrow. The moment the black sword light touched his left eyebrow, his body seemed to turn into an empty world and was going to take in all the power of this black sword light. Yet everyone could clearly see a thread of blood sprayed out, and a wound appeared on his left eyebrow. His left eyebrow was broken. Hearts connected, untraceable. The Emperor of Chu and some of the old people present could see that Yen Ying's sword essence still came from that person. In the past, Yen Ying, the Grandmaster, had set that person as his only goal. He had spent much effort on comprehending that person's moves. At this time, no one knew if Yen Ying was purposely angering him or if he felt that this was the best move against the enemy. So he used such a sword move. There was no time for anyone present to think. A black orchid bloomed in Yen Ying's hand. This black orchid seemed to have a life of its own. It gave off a greedy presence towards the blood coming out of the Yuan-Wu Emperor's eyebrow. But in the next moment, the black orchid disappeared on its own. It turned into streams of black energy that seeped into the blood and the bright light around the Yuan-Wu Emperor. No one could sense what kind of technique Yen Ying was using at this moment. Many people looked expectantly at the Yuan-Wu Emperor, hoping to see the Yuan-Wu Emperor fall to the ground or retreat. But the Yuan-Wu Emperor's body only shook slightly. He still slashed with the yellow sword in his hand. His sword move was completely unleashed. The air between him and Yen Ying twisted violently. Finally, with a crack, everything was cut apart. Yen Ying's body completely stopped moving. He frowned slightly and lowered his head calmly. The Yuan-Wu Emperor had already sheathed his sword. The countless rays of light falling from the sky started to fade. In everyone's perception, he was incomparably tall. His body, as tall as the sky, was rapidly shrinking. There was nothing unusual in front of Yanning, but when he lowered his head, a bright ray of light appeared behind him. Pew, 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 countless streams of black yin-chi shot out along this bright ray of light. It was like black water flowing on the smooth surface of a crystal mirror. The dark and gloomy yin energy contained a mountainous force, but everyone sensed that there was an even more powerful and terrifying power flying between the heavens and the earth. It was a sword light. Someone looked at the mountain opposite Deer Mountain, where the Yuanwu Emperor was facing. Someone finally understood. A sword light had cut through Yen Ying's body and forced out all the power in Yen Ying's body. But now, this straight sword light was falling towards the opposite mountain. The opposite mountain suddenly shook. A circle of dust shot out near the top of the mountain. In the next moment, countless cracking sounds could be heard from the mountain. The cracking sounds gathered into a terrifying roar. Everyone was shocked speechless. Along the wave of dust, the mountain split in two. The top of the mountain, weighing tens of thousands of kilograms, slid backwards and collided with the mountain below. It gave off a great sound that no one had ever heard before. The cut mountain was as smooth as a mirror. The mountain had originally been taller than Deer Mountain, but now the part higher than Deer Mountain had been cut off. The mountain peak was smoother than any ground. Enormous waves of dust surged. Without the obstruction of the mountain, wild winds came from behind the mountain. Through the thinning dust, one sight was unobstructed. Behind the mountain was a flat river valley. Through the river valley, one could attack the Chu lands, the Yen lands, or the Qi lands. The bright yellow sword in the Yuanwu Emperor's hand disappeared. He looked at the bowed Yanning, looked at the shocked people, and looked at the mountain he had flattened. He said, "This lonely one wants that mountain." Chapter 213. This lonely one wants that mountain. This lonely one wants that mountain. The Yuanwu Emperor's voice was very calm, but as the wild wind swept across Deer Mountain and echoed through the mountains, it seemed to resound in everyone's souls. That mountain was behind Deer Mountain to the Qin lands. If he wanted that mountain, he naturally wanted to take the peaks of Deer Mountain as well. Deer Mountain was on the side of Wu Mountain, parallel to Wu Mountain. It was the border between the dynasties. If this place belonged to the Qin dynasty, it was akin to the Qin dynasty expanding this side of the border 100 miles. Even the area around Wu Mountain would fall into the control of the Qin dynasty, especially since this place was a place to be charged. If there were troops stationed in the mountains, they could attack and defend like a dagger that could stab into the territories of the dynasties at any time. But at this time, no one present on the peak of Deer Mountain had the time to consider the Yuanwu Emperor's ambitions and the profound meaning of this place belonging to the Qin lands. Everyone was still looking at the flattened mountain and pondering the cultivation he had displayed. Sometimes a person's cultivation and power could not decide too many things. But when a person's cultivation and power reached a certain level, like the Yu Emperor in the past, then all strategies would become meaningless. How far was the Yuanwu Emperor from the Yu Emperor in the past? How many realm sevens would it take to kill him? This was the question that many people around Deer Mountain were thinking about first. At this time, Ding Ning was also pondering this question. His face was pale as he looked at the flattened mountain. His cultivation was too far from most of the cultivators around Deer Mountain. He could not sense some of the weaker energy vibrations, but the Yuanwu Emperor's last attack had been extremely powerful, and he had sensed it clearly. The Yuanwu Emperor's cultivation was no longer a secret to him. The Yuanwu Emperor's cultivation was a minor realm higher than he had expected. So he had not just entered Realm 8, but Realm 8 Second Class. Realm 8 Second Class was invincible cultivation in the world. Your cultivation, and the power of that sword did not completely come from you. Since you have chosen such a path and cultivated such a sword, it is not impossible for me to defeat you in the future. But as he looked at the mountain that had been flattened by the sword, such a thought sounded in his mind. No more light fell from the sky. The dragon eyes on the Yuanwu Emperor's dragon robe dimmed. The sky darkened. The clouds that had been crushed by the terrifying primal energies of the universe turned gray-black, and then many drops of rain fell. Sorrowful cries sounded. These sorrowful voices came from the seats of the Qi dynasty. While Emperor Qin of Han had completely disappeared, he had not originally belonged to the Chu dynasty. Before this, no one in the Chu dynasty had any feelings for him. Yanning was different. He usually did not appear, but in reality, he was the top grandmaster of the Qi dynasty. He was deeply respected by the Qi cultivators who knew of his deeds, especially when all the power in his body had been taken away by the Yuanwu Emperor's sword. His body had been cut in two, and he could not move at all. But his consciousness had not dissipated. This made everyone in the Qi dynasty even more sorrowful. The Qi Emperor's face was pale. He looked at Yan Ying's figure and thought of Yan Ying's orders on the way here. He took a deep breath and prepared to order people to preserve Yan Ying's body so that it could be transported back to the Qi. But at this time, a faint wisp of black smoke floated out of Yan Ying's body. Everyone on the peak of Deer Mountain stopped breathing. Although they did not understand Yan Ying's secret technique, everyone could feel that after the wisp of black smoke drifted out from Yan Ying's body, Yan Ying's body did not have the last trace of human aura. It was as if he had completely turned into two cold and hard pieces of dead wood. Was this the Yin energy formed by Yan Ying's last consciousness? This was the last stroke this Qi Grandmaster left in the world. What did he want to do? Everyone stared at the faint wisp of black smoke, afraid that they would miss any detail. This wisp of black smoke did not dissipate. Facing the wild wind, it floated towards the flattened mountain. Before it reached the mountain, the wisp of black smoke formed into the shape of a small black infant. An even smaller wisp of smoke flowed out of the lower body of this small black infant. From a distance, it looked like a black infant was peeing at the flattened mountain. Everyone stilled. After a few breaths, the sorrowful cries of the Qi dynasty stopped. Almost all the people of the Qin dynasty had angry expressions, because everyone understood Yan Ying's meaning. What is the use if you are strong? I am still fearless and disdainful. A hint of anger appeared in the Yuanwu Emperor's eyes, but in the next moment, his gaze became absolutely calm and emotionless. That black infant had dissipated in the wind. Li Kaitian had died. Emperor Qin of Han had died. Yanning had died. 3 grandmasters had died in the world. These 3 people who were a threat to him in terms of cultivation had all died. If you want another 9 years of peace, then agree to this lonely one's request. The Yuanwu Emperor turned his head coldly and said to the king of Chu, at this time, the Qin dynasty had hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers in Yangshan Commandery. They could invade the Chu lands at any time and take the Chu capital. So he asked the king of Chu first. More wrinkles appeared on the king of Chu's face. To everyone's surprise, he looked up at the Yuanwu Emperor without much anger and said, this place in exchange for 9 years of peace. This request is not excessive. Li Lingjun turned to look in disbelief at the king of Chu. He felt that the king of Chu would at least consider the Yan and Qi's intentions. He had not expected the king of Chu to agree directly. He had been in Chongling for a long time and knew just how humiliated the brave Qin people felt after Yangshan Commandery was taken away, and how much they valued land. For the Qin people, it was easy to give them this kind of land, but it was not so easy to take it back. The Emperor of Yen narrowed his eyes and looked at the Emperor of Qi at the side. The Emperor of Qi was silent for a moment and said, "I have no objections. You can decide." The Emperor of Yen lowered his eyebrows slightly and said, "If so, then we will meet again on that mountain in 9 years." It was decided like this. Other than the 4 emperors, everyone on Deer Mountain shook in unison. They all understood the Emperor of Yan's meaning. They would make an agreement to not offend each other for 9 years and then hold a conference 9 years later. But the location of the conference would not be this Deer Mountain, but the mountain that had been flattened by the sword. But none of them had expected the 3 emperors to agree so readily. Their opinions were unusually unanimous. This conference would end so easily. With such an agreement, the Qin dynasty didn't just take back Yangshan Commandery, but also the Wu Mountains. They created a stronghold that could attack the 3 dynasties at any time and pressed the border 100 miles closer to the 3 dynasties. The danger of the Wu Mountains was akin to the Qin dynasty building a steep and enormous wall out of thin air. The benefits that the Qin dynasty obtained in this unprecedented conference could not be exchanged with the lives of millions of Qin swordsmen. Yet, hearing his opponents agree, the Yuanwu emperor did not show any joy on his face. Instead, a hint of disdain appeared at the corners of his mouth. He thought slowly inside, just a pile of vulgar things. Since ancient times, the power of an agreement came from reputation and trust, and not martial power. Even if one of the parties to the alliance had superior martial strength, it would often lead to many unpredictable consequences if the alliance was easily torn apart. Things like reputation and trust seemed illusory in normal times, but sometimes they could play a decisive role in a great battle. For example, in the battles of some small tribes that shared a common hatred for the enemy would often win. And in the world of cultivators, the result of disregarding one's reputation and trust might be that one would attract many unimaginable opponents. The Yuanwu emperor naturally knew this. His words inside were not because he felt that he could ignore the agreement, but because he was disdaining the hypocrisy of the 3 emperors in front of him. As the rain fell at a strange rhythm, the 3 emperors of the agreement started to leave the banquet. A ceremonial official was responsible for the complicated and dignified procedures. The Yuanwu emperor stood motionless. His slightly disdainful gaze swept across Deer Mountain. The armies and cultivators of the Yen, Chu, and Qi dynasties still did not move. With his great strategy and peerless cultivation, Emperor Yuanwu had forced the 3 dynasties to make such an agreement. At this time, Emperor Yuanwu was the strongest he had ever been in his life. Yet his vital energy had been used up, and he was also at his weakest. The slight mockery in his eyes expanded infinitely and finally turned into an indescribable proud smile. As his smile spread, he looked at the mountains around Deer Mountain and shouted disdainfully, "Since you have come to kill me at this time, why hide? When have the people of the Bazankendo ground ever been so cowardly?" As he shouted, many people on the peak of Deer Mountain shook as though they had sensed something. They turned to look at a mountain. The rain falling from the sky suddenly grew heavier. The sky grew darker. The golden dragon on the Yuanwu emperor's dragon robe grew dimmer. Whoosh! An exceptionally sharp and powerful aura suddenly soared into the sky from the mountain that everyone was looking at. A bolt of lightning appeared in the sky. This bolt of lightning did not come from the top, but from the bottom to the top. When they sensed this abnormality, many people at the peak of Deer Mountain finally reacted. This was a sword light. Bazankendo ground, the words that came from the Yuanwu emperor's mouth. And the sword light caused the blood of many people at the peak to freeze. Many people's eardrums were ringing. Boom! But the shock did not stop. At this time, an exceptionally violent presence exploded from another mountain. A figure rose into the air from that mountain and flew towards the Yuanwu Emperor like a meteor with terrifying killing intent. All the raindrops in the sky were attracted by this person, as though this person was the legendary immortal who summoned clouds and rain. The two grandmasters who occupied the mountains showed their killing intent at the same time. Their target was the weakened Yuanwu Emperor. Some people's hearts beat like drums. They started to understand why the three emperors just now had reached an agreement so easily. They also started to understand that Emperor Chen of Han and Yanning were just the prelude to this shocking attack. But this was not the end. The moment that figure soared into the sky, another terrifying aura that could pierce the heavens and slaughter the earth rose from the top of another mountain. A wild killing intent that seemed to carry the stench of the sea swept towards Emperor Yuanwu at the same time. Chapter 214. When the sword light that was even more stunning than lightning appeared, the king of Chu's old face was covered in an unusual flush. This unusual flush caused the age spots on his face to turn bright red, like blooming plum blossoms. When the Yen first attacked and Li Kaitian died, he knew that there was a grand scheme behind this. But he had not expected this grand scheme to be so astounding that even the top grandmaster of the Qi dynasty, Yan Ying, did not hesitate to die to pave the way. The king of Qi's eyes were filled with deep shock, true shock. He had listened to Yan Ying's words and quietly watched the play. He had not expected to see such a grand play in the end. He sensed clearly that it was a peachwood sword with a sword light more stunning than lightning. There was an old peach tree in the Bazin Kendo ground that did not die after being struck by lightning multiple times. In the end, the peachwood core formed seal scripts that were suited to absorbing lightning energy and was made into a peachwood sword by the swordsmen of the Bazin Kendo ground. Ding Ning looked at the 3 waves of killing intent that surged up from the surrounding mountains, and his pupils shrank slightly. The owner of this peachwood sword was naturally Yi Xinhe of the Bazin Kendo ground, the one who flew through the air and attracted thousands of rain droplets like the legendary immortal who summoned clouds, and rain was naturally Song Chaoshen. The one who gave off a strong fishy smell and even a hint of madness in his killing intent was naturally the crazy grandmaster of Blue Jade Island, Guodongjiang. He was not unfamiliar with these 3 people. The 1,000-year sword horde of the Bazin Kendo ground exploded in one day. Dozens of years ago, many geniuses appeared, and they were all the top talents of their time. At the time, all the dynasties in the world exclaimed that they did not know what kind of fortune had gathered in the Bazin Kendo ground. Yi Xinhe was able to wield one of the most important weapons of the Bazin Kendo ground, the divine peach sword, when the Bazin Kendo ground was at its peak. Of course, he was one of the top talents of the Bazin Kendo ground. In the past, in the war against the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, he had taken the role of an assassin that went deep into the heart of each dynasty. When the army at the front was fighting, he would often be in a certain city of the enemy, taking the opportunity to assassinate an important noble or cultivator. Just like how great rebels like Xiao Yi and Bai Shanshui were not willing to easily enter Chongling, many cities were like giant urns for cultivators. It was easy to enter, but difficult to leave. Going deep into enemy territory was more dangerous than fighting on the battlefield. Yi Xinhe had traveled from one dynasty to another, and his ability to hide and evade assassination was far beyond the reach of other grandmasters. After the Bazin Kendo ground was destroyed, there had been rumors that he had died in that battle. After more than 10 years, there had been no news of his whereabouts. Ding Ning had also thought that he was dead, but he did not expect to see him here. Looking at the sword light, right now, the 9-heaven lightning sword he cultivated had reached its peak. Putting aside cultivation, Even the old masters of the Bazin Kendo ground could not use it so perfectly. Song Chaosheng of the Wei dynasty's Song family had been one of the strongest grandmasters of the Wei dynasty back then. He had also been one of the leaders who had opposed the king of Wei building the Spirit Canal and Cloud Water Palace's dominance. But just like the old nobility of the Qin dynasty's reform, the Song family had been destroyed by the king of Wei and Cloud Water Palace. In the end, the capital of the Wei dynasty was taken by the Qin army. When the Wei dynasty was destroyed, someone had seen him sing a sad song and shed 1,000 tears. Each tear turned into a tide, causing the unfinished Spirit Canal of the Wei dynasty to rise 3 feet. Then he disappeared without a trace and never appeared again. As to Guodongjiang, very few people knew that this crazy overseas cultivator was friends with the master of the last flower sword on Ding Ning's body. The sea routes of the Qin dynasty could not be opened just by the arrival of the armored ships. They had also been created by the swords of many people. During the Qin dynasty's reform, many people had become lifelong enemies with the swordsmen of the Bazin Kendo ground. Some people had become friends through fighting. Ding Ning should have been happy that the 3 of them had worked together to assassinate the Yuanwu emperor. If he had followed forefather Zhou here, Ding Ning would have been happy. But he had come with Pan Rui and Mo Shouqing. Everything he saw with his own eyes reminded him that the Yuanwu emperor seemed to have predicted something like this would happen. So what he wanted to do the most right now was to shout for these 3 to change their minds. But even if he shouted, would these 3 listen to him even if they heard him? If the 3 of them knew his true identity, who among them would listen, and who wouldn't? In the previous battle between Emperor Qin of Han, Yan Ying, and the Yuanwu emperor, while Emperor Qin of Han and Yan Ying had earned his respect and allowed him to understand all of the Yuanwu emperor's secrets and win his respect and gratitude, those 2 grandmasters did not have a direct connection to him like the people who were attacking now. Therefore, the chill in his body became even more intense at this moment, even though he kept telling himself to be absolutely calm, because only absolute calm could allow him to see things clearly. His hands still unconsciously started to tremble. Chong Feng, release! Shrill military orders sounded on Deer Mountain. The emperors of the Chu, Yan, and Qi dynasties had all agreed to the Yuanwu emperor's request in order to withdraw and show that they had nothing to do with what happened next. They would not be accused of using the alliance to kill the emperor of the Qin dynasty. Under such tacit understanding, the armies of the 3 dynasties could not move at all. They were even quieter than when they were resting. But the battle-hardened elites of the Qin dynasty would not allow an assassin to kill their beloved emperor. Some unique military orders were used to mobilize cultivators to activate their seal weapons. When the raindrops on Deer Mountain gathered towards Song Chaosheng in the air, a terrifying energy tide exploded on one side of Deer Mountain. Astounding pillars of wind shot into the sky. Inside, countless blue lights flashed. They were all blue arrows that shot out like meteors. As the wind blew, the countless green arrows left streaks of green trails behind them. It was as if they were drawing long talismans, completely breaking free from the shackles of gravity. Instead, they flew faster and faster. Finally, the air in front of the arrow tip started to burn. The wind wrapped around the flames. The entire sky seemed to be burning. The power of an army, especially a well-formed army, was not something that individual cultivators could match. For example, mountainous beetles would often be bitten to death by ants. In the 3 years before the Yuanwu emperor ascended the throne, in the bloody storm of Chongling, many great experts of the Bazin Kendo ground had been killed by the army or cultivators slightly weaker than them. Seeing this burning presence, many Yan, Chu, and Qi generals felt great helplessness and sorrow in their eyes. They knew that the Qin dynasty was so strong now because of the reforms of the past. The country was too strong, and many students from cultivation places joined the army each year. In the end, the army was too strong. Yet Song Chaosheng, who was flying through the air, did not seem to care about this burning presence. His body didn't seem to move at all. Or rather, he had predicted that such a scene would appear. The thousands of raindrops that gathered towards him started to fall. Each raindrop seemed weak and powerless as it fell, but each raindrop fell at the same time. They rubbed against the primal energies of the universe and vibrated at the same frequency. In nature, two identical raindrops could not appear at the same time. But now there were countless identical raindrops in the sky. These raindrops formed a terrifying tide. With an enormous boom, the arrow fire was extinguished. All the raindrops turned into powder, but the terrifying power of the tide still fell from the sky and landed in the camp of the Qin army. An even more muffled boom sounded halfway up Deer Mountain. Then there were the sounds of metal falling to the ground and flesh flying. Many bodies, even incomplete bodies, jumped up from the ground together with some heavy weapons and were thrown out without any reason. Such a violent attack was to pave the way for the sword light that was sharper than lightning. Song Chaosheng had only flown halfway. He was in the middle of two mountains when the peach god sword on the Bazin Kendo ground reached the peak of Deer Mountain. The Yuanwu Emperor was almost out of vital energy, but facing such a sword, he proudly shook his head at Marquis Su. Then he reached out towards Huang Jinwei, next to him. Huang Jinwei was standing next to him. When the Yuanwu Emperor reached out, Huang Jinwei suddenly became extremely weak. He also reached out towards the Yuanwu Emperor. A pure white lotus seed appeared in his hand. Then, in the next moment, all of the true essence in his body, even the 5 qis, gushed out from his palm and converged into the pure white lotus seed. Layers of bright yellow lines appeared on the surface of this pure white lotus seed, and it turned into a bright yellow pill. The presence of this bright yellow pill was very similar to the presence of the Yuanwu Emperor. This bright yellow pill landed in the hands of the Yuanwu Emperor. Then the Yuanwu Emperor smiled proudly, swallowed this pill, and swung his sword again. Chapter 215. At this time, of all the cultivators around Deer Mountain, other than Huang Jinwei, only Dingning and Mo Shouqing knew of the Yuanwu Emperor's secret. So when they saw Huang Jinwei condense his core and felt the enormous and empty gullies in the Yuanwu Emperor's body fill with vital energy, even Pan Rui beside Mo Shouqing felt indescribable shock. The King of Chu's unusual red face quickly turned pale. His lips became even redder, as if all the redness on his face had gathered between his lips. There was a painful cough. He coughed up blood. The bright eyes of the Qi and Yan emperors immediately dimmed. The Yuanwu Emperor grew strong again, his body growing larger in their senses until he was as tall as the sky. He gave a furious howl on the mountain. Yi Xinha, who found that he had fallen into a trap, did not care about Song Chaosheng, who was flying between the two mountains, and decisively put his sword away. Some people advanced, some retreated, but advancing and retreating was for the best result. With an enormous boom, countless people's eardrums bled, and they could not hear anything. An unimaginably huge pillar of lightning fell from the sky. It was so huge that it would require at least dozens of people to encircle it. The peachwood sword went against the flow of this huge pillar of lightning, as if it wanted to follow the lightning and pierce a hole in the sky to escape. You think it is so easy to come and go as you wish. The Yuanwu Emperor had a strong and confident expression. He looked sympathetically at the sword light, shook his head, and said. His tone was like he was speaking to a child. One of the former heroes of the Bazin Kendo ground was like a panicked child in front of him. He swung his sword. Song Chaosheng, who was flying between the two mountains, paled. He sensed the Yuanwu Emperor's sword coming towards him. He shouted in a low voice. Countless curved seal lines suddenly appeared in the air in front of him. His vital energy charged out of his body and flooded into these seal lines. He tried to create the strongest wave he could create in his life to stop the Yuanwu Emperor's attack. However, at this moment, his face became even paler. The bright yellow longsword slashed at him, and the sword essence also came at him. But the true sword energy rose from the ground without a trace and cut into the enormous pillar of lightning, a sword light that looked like a transparent crystal sliced through the terrifying lightning pillar like a tree and accurately struck the sword light that was trying to escape upwards. Crack, 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 crack. The enormous pillar of lightning gave off continuous cracking sounds like it was made of solid crystal. This astounding pillar of lightning immediately shattered like a block of ice, turning into thousands of dancing lightning snakes in the air. The transparent crystal-like sword light was still extremely condensed and stuck to the sword light. At this moment, the scene gave people the illusion that time had stopped flowing, as the lightning on the sword light, a yellowish-brown wooden sword. Then the wooden sword trembled as if it was in pain and began to break apart piece by piece. Boom, boom, boom. Continuous thunder rumbled in the sky. Every single piece of wood contained an astonishing amount of pressure, and they were all sent flying for an unknown number of miles before exploding violently. The Peach God Sword was undoubtedly one of the best swords on the Bazin Kendo ground. Yixinhe was undoubtedly one of the strongest swordsmen in the world right now. But the Yuanwu Emperor had shattered the Peach God Sword with one blow. The Peach God Sword shattered. The peak from which the Peach God Sword had flown out shook violently. Countless trees and grasses broke apart like they had been cut by a sharp weapon. A layer of blood mist suddenly sprayed out from the skin of a long-haired man who was wearing ordinary cotton clothes and had an ethereal figure, killing Emperor Qin of Han, Yanning, and now the Peach God Sword. All the cultivators on the peak of Deer Mountain could not describe the presence of the Yuanwu Emperor, but a mad roar sounded in the sky. Yuanwu, you really think you are invincible? An enormous figure giving off crimson flames charged out of the peak, filled with the smell of the sea, and walked through the air. With such a shout, a deep blue long blade suddenly appeared in the air behind Song Chaosheng. A mountainous energy fell from the sky and smashed onto the long blade. Blade energy spread in all directions and turned into enormous waves. An enormous deep blue wave appeared in the sky. Song Chaosheng did not look back. Sensing the appearance of this enormous wave, the hesitation on his face turned to solemnity and dignity. The seal lines in front of him rose up. In the next moment, he hit the deep blue wave with all his power. Another muffled and terrifying collision sounded in the air. Under the impact of Song Chaosheng's wave, the dark blue wave in front of him did not accelerate. Instead, it strangely stagnated. In the next moment, with a cracking sound, the dark blue long saber was slapped out and broke through the wave. The long blade that had been slapped out seemed to have perfectly gathered the power of the two people. A straight light mark appeared in front of the blade and did not seem to belong to the mortal world. At the same time, on the mountain where all the vegetation had been cut apart, Yixinhe, whose skin was splattered with bloody mist, once again let out a determined howl. His entire body soared into the sky, emitting a dazzling sword light and an aura of mutual destruction. You really think you are invincible in the world? Gu Dongjiang's mad shout was still echoing through the valley. Before the blade light arrived, the overwhelming pressure caused the vital energy of many cultivators on the peak of Deer Mountain to be unable to flow smoothly. While he had shattered the Peach God's sword with one blow, everyone was certain that the Yuanwu Emperor was greatly exhausted and could not make another blow like just now. The three grandmasters flying overhead clearly disregarded life and death, regardless of how much power they could produce after disregarding life and death. At least from Yi Xinha's retreat and coming in just now, these three grandmasters felt that they had a great chance of killing the Yuanwu Emperor by sacrificing their lives. Yet the Yuanwu Emperor did not show any fear on his face. He held his sword in front of him and narrowed his eyes at the blade light. He said, "Wang Jingmeng is dead, Yan Xinlan is dead, Mo Bieli is dead, so I am naturally invincible." These three names had been the strongest of the Bazin Kendo ground in the past, and cultivators who had walked in front of him in cultivation. At the same time, he would completely erase these three names and would not mention them normally. But previously, Yan Ing had said that he feared the name of that person. So when he said it now, he was telling everyone his strength and fearlessness. The blade light was in front, and the sword light that Yi Xinha had turned into was behind. The blade and sword, burning with the brightest light and killing intent of the cultivation world in the last decade, attacked Yuanwu. At the same time, almost all the wild peach trees outside of Deer Mountain bloomed, and the mountain was dyed red. In the sky that was filled with killing intent, there was one more tranquil white cloud. The mountain flowers were in full bloom. Naturally, it was the Qi's true young Marquis Li. The cloud was naturally the nameless Taoist of the Scroll sect who had left the mountain of his own accord. These two people had completely revealed their cultivation, but did not attack. They did not stop the blade and sword in order to show their existence, intimidate, and restrain the people on the mountain who wanted to help the Yuanwu Emperor. These were all grandmasters who surpassed the other realm 7 in the world. Now, these grandmasters wanted the Yuanwu Emperor to die. On the mountain where Ding Ning was, Mo Shouqing also attacked. Mo Shouqing's vital energy flooded out of his body, but it was not violent at all. All of it turned into a thin and exceptionally high presence that evaporated into the world like water vapor. In this moment, Ding Ning looked at Mo Shouqing's back and had an impulse to attack. He wanted to change the result here. Maybe if he killed Mo Shouqing right now, he could change the result here. But Mo Shouqing had Pan Rui next to him. If his cultivation was Realm 5 right now, Pan Rui, who had almost no vital energy in her body, would not be able to stop him from killing Mo Shouqing. But his cultivation was not high enough. Pan Rui could easily kill him. The best opportunity had appeared, but his cultivation was 2 levels lower than his opponent's. This was fate. He looked coldly at the scene in front of him. He could not breathe, and did not have time to breathe. Yi Xinha's sword light flashed across the sky above Guodongjiang and Song Chaosheng. Suddenly, something changed. The sword light condensed, and suddenly fell down like a broken meteor. Everyone's hearts dropped. Guodongjiang trembled in fury and screamed. His palms reached towards the sky as he ignored the sword light and slapped towards Yi Xinha's body. With a crack, the sword light cut through his body and caused his body to give off the sound of twigs breaking. It was impossible for his palms to touch Yi Xinha's body, but a palm print appeared on Yi Xinha's chest and one side of her face. With a muffled shout, Yi Xinha's body flew backwards, like a meteor. Song Chaosheng also shouted angrily. Yi Xinha had started this trap. Yi Xinha had secretly set it up on the Bazin Kendo ground. If not for Yi Xinha's invitation, he and Guodongjiang may not have appeared here. Without this trap, Li Kaitian, Emperor Qin of Han, and Yanning would not have died one after another. But Yi Xinha, who had started this trap, had betrayed them all. How could he not be angry? As he shouted angrily, The Yuanwu Emperor calmly sent out his sword to meet the blade light. He only cared about this blade light and ignored everything else. The white flowing cloud in the sky was about to fall. But at this time, an invisible wall appeared under the white cloud. Someone gave a serene sigh. At the same time, an endless stream of sword chi surged up from another mountain. This sword energy was not strong and did not seem to affect the battle at this time. But this sword seemed to be able to encircle all of Deer Mountain and the surrounding mountains. When such a sword energy appeared, people on the peak of Deer Mountain finally guessed that the shallow sword marks that had surrounded the mountain had come from the Prime Minister of Chongling, who had come with the Yuanwu Emperor, but had not shown himself. All of the peach blossoms around Deer Mountain dimmed and withered. The world was empty. Everyone could feel the two presences leave. A soft sound sounded in front of the Yuanwu Emperor. Countless crystalline cracks appeared in the air in front of him. There were faint marks of blood between his thumb and index finger. Then he put his sword away. The dark blue long saber fell in front of him, stabbing into the ground diagonally in front of him. Long wind. Release. A series of shrill military orders rang out again. Countless blue pillars of wind charged into the sky and then started to burn. Song Chaosheng stopped his furious roar. He looked at the Yuanwu Emperor in the distance and sighed. He no longer had the power to stop these seal weapons. His body disappeared into the burning celestial fire. Guodongjiang died. Song Chaosheng died. Other than young Marquis Li and the nameless Taoist who had left, almost all of the grandmasters in the world had died. Chapter 216. The chaotic primal energies of the universe flew in all directions at the peak of Deer Mountain, giving off giant chimes that seemed to echo through the world. The Yuanwu Emperor stood with his hands behind his back, his face slightly pale. His hands were trembling uncontrollably, and blood dripped from his fingertips. After using all his power to fight against these great grandmasters of the world, he was extremely tired. Yet he felt that each of his breaths was unusually sweet. A feeling of power he had never felt before filled his body as he breathed. The mountains and lands are under my feet. In the future, who can be on par with this lonely one? He proudly raised his head, looking at the distant mountains and lands, as he thought slowly inside. Almost all of the vegetation on Deer Mountain had been destroyed. Many gullies had been formed on the mountain walls by the rain and primal energies of the universe. There were threads of blood in the flowing water. All of the Qin dynasty troops stationed in the mountains saw the chaotic primal energies of the universe disappear, the bright light scatter, and the bright yellow figure standing with his hands behind his back. Even though they were surrounded by broken military equipment and bloody limbs, they could not help but shout in unison, "Long live the Emperor! Long live the Emperor!" Amidst such cheers, the Emperor of Yen had an ugly expression. He turned and left without a glance. The Emperor of Qi was stunned for a long time. Then he sighed. He was very sorrowful inside, but at the same time, he found that he admired Yuanwu. Emperor Qin of Han had fled in a dung cart and hid from the cultivators of the Qin dynasty outside the pass for more than a decade. Yening was half a step realm 8. He did not hesitate to die in order to trigger the final trap. Song Chaosheng's family had been destroyed by the Qin people before the Wei dynasty was destroyed. He had watched helplessly as his country was destroyed, and his tears flowed like a tide. Guodongjiang wanted to take revenge for his friend. While he was mad, he had endured for more than a decade. These great grandmasters most likely wanted to kill the Yuanwu Emperor at all times. They had waited and schemed for more than a decade. Finally, they had gotten a chance to kill the Yuanwu Emperor, but they had still lost to the Yuanwu Emperor. In addition to Li Kaitian and Feng Xiang, after the Battle of Deer Mountain, The great grandmasters who could match the Yuanwu emperor and possibly catch up to him had all disappeared. How could the Yuanwu emperor's strength lie in his cultivation? So Yi Xinhe is also one of His Majesty's chess pieces. Huang Jinwei fought against the strong drowsiness that engulfed his body. He tried his best to keep his eyes open as he looked at the Yuanwu emperor, who was bathed in the sunlight. Yi Xinhe was naturally the most important chess piece in this trap. However, this chess piece had been buried before the Yuanwu emperor ascended the throne. It had been buried for so many years. Even Huang Jinwei did not know that Yi Xinhe's sword could be used by the Yuanwu emperor. Li Lingjuan's body trembled uncontrollably. The king of Chu's health was extremely poor. With his cultivation, just now, when he coughed up blood due to his emotions, it was enough for anyone to know that the king of Chu did not have much time left. He would soon become the new monarch of the Chu dynasty. But the Yuanwu emperor's methods had not only allowed the Deer Mountain Conference to take back Yangshan Commandery and push the border 100 miles, but also set up such a trap and killed many of the great grandmasters who were a threat to him. Even if no one in the Chu dynasty doubted him and consort Zhao in the future and supported him, he still felt terror and had no confidence. Next to him, the king of Chu looked at the Yuanwu emperor's figure. For some reason, his expression grew calmer, and in the end, he became thoughtful. His calmness even attracted the attention of the Yuanwu emperor. The Yuanwu emperor once again looked at this old man who was about to die. Looking at the strength and satisfaction in the Yuanwu emperor's eyes, the old man suddenly smiled slightly. The Yuanwu emperor was even more puzzled. In his view, the Chu dynasty should have suffered the greatest loss in this conference, so he could not understand the king of Chu's emotions right now. Congratulations, imperial son. Hearing the cheers from Deer Mountain ahead, Mo Shouqing turned his head emotionally and said sincerely to Fu Su. Fu Su was still dazed from the great shock and could not immediately understand the meaning of Mo Shouqing's words. But Mo Shouqing knew the cold ding-ning inside. After the Deer Mountain Conference, the Qin dynasty would leap to become the strongest dynasty in the world. Fu Su would naturally become the crown prince of the strongest dynasty in the world. Everything seemed to be moving under the control of Zheng Xiu and the Yuanwu emperor. Ding Ning seemed to not dare to face the supreme presence of Deer Mountain. He slowly turned his body. His gaze first landed on the mountain peak, where the exceptionally long sword light seemed to be able to encircle all of Deer Mountain. That was the yearning sword. There was no emotion in the world that was as lingering as yearning. It was sorrowful and hard to understand, and could not be stopped by mountains and rivers. The other peerless sword manual of the Bazin Kendo ground had been comprehended by Minister Li, one of the two prime ministers under the Yuanwu emperor's throne. Young Marquis Li and the nameless Taoist from the scroll were strong, but they were still a bit weaker than Minister Li. Just now, if they did not leave now, they may never be able to leave. Ding Ning's gaze landed on the mountain valley, where Yi Xinhe had fallen. At this time, the mountain valley was filled with smoke. The collision of the primal energies of the universe summoned by these great grandmasters had caused the ground in the mountain valley to sink several feet. But Ding Ning was certain that with Yi Xinhe's wounds just now, Yi Xinhe would not die after falling. Yi Xinhe. Ding Ning closed his eyes again and used all his strength to shout this name in his heart. The wall of the wine shop in Falling Parasol appeared in his mind. There was an enormous flower blooming eerily in an empty space on the wall. When he closed his eyes outside Deer Mountain and thought of the painted wall in the Falling Parasol wine shop, many people were waiting silently in Chongling. In a small courtyard, Zhangsun Qianxue was steaming glutinous rice. Her fingers seemed to be even whiter than the glutinous rice. The spring breeze was like a pair of scissors that cut off the green leaves of Chongling's trees. It gently swept into the courtyard and occasionally lifted the curtain, looking at the painted wall that was occasionally revealed behind the curtain, and thinking of the meaning contained in this wall. Zhang Sun Qianshue's cold brows suddenly showed some irritation. She stopped looking at the fire in annoyance and allowed the flames in the kitchen to extinguish. She was certain that even if something happened to Ding Ning on Deer Mountain or Wu Mountain, she would still stay in Chongling and wait for the day she could kill Jing Xiu and Yuan Wu. But she was also certain that without Ding Ning, she would not be used to anything. Why did you die? Why did you die? She couldn't help but think of that person again. Her eyes were filled with both hatred and anger, and her eyelashes couldn't help but tremble. In a small courtyard not far from her, Zhang Yi was boiling water. He looked at the dry wood in the stove with a focused expression. Each time he shoved several pieces of dry wood into the stove, several threads of primal energies of the universe would fly out of him and fall into the red coals under the dry wood. The dry wood immediately burned fiercely. Moments later, the water in the pot gurgled and white steam roiled. He used his fingers as a sword and swept them. The slightly boiling water in the pot flew out like a snake and fell into the large wooden tub at the side. He added some cold water and tested the temperature. Then he added more water to the pot. Then he shouted towards the courtyard, "Little sect brother, you can bring cave master to bathe." Shen Yi supported Shui Wangshu as they slowly appeared in his sight. Seeing Shen Yi help Shui Wangshu into the tub and use an old loofah to help Shui Wangshu scrub his back, Zhang Yi was reassured. He used hot water to soak Shui Wangshu's clothes and started to wash them. As he did these things, Zhang Yi was like an ordinary youth who had lived in Falling Parasol for a long time. He had completely forgotten how restrained he had been at the start and didn't even dare to shout loudly. But when he shouted, "Little sect brother," he couldn't help but think of Ding Ning. Before Shen Yi entered the sect, Ding Ning was the little sect brother of White Goat Cave. Shui Wangshu lived in Falling Parasol and seemed to enjoy each day. But he knew that Shui Wangshu's health was deteriorating. I wonder where junior sect brother Ding Ning is right now. I wonder if he is safe. He looked at the steam and wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. He knew, but he couldn't help but look inquisitively at Shen Yi and Shui Wangshu. He said, "The Deer Mountain Conference should end today. The day of the Deer Mountain Conference is today." Shen Yi looked at Zhang Yi through the white mist and said seriously, "Senior sect brother Ding Ning can see the situation better than anyone else. He is just watching from a distance and will not be in any danger. After today, he should return and prepare to attend the Min Mountain Sword trials." While he said this, Shen Yi did not have much confidence. What if something happened at the Deer Mountain Conference? What if the Holy One did not gain any advantage in the negotiations with the three dynasties, and something unexpected happened? Zhang Yi made a sound of acknowledgement as though he agreed with Shen Yi's words. But he was not confident either. Shui Wangshu naturally knew better than these young people what it meant to be unpredictable. He smiled faintly and said, "You two idiots, what's the use of worrying? I can wait, can't you wait?" Zhang Yi and Shen Yi did not speak. In this spring of the 12th year of Yuan Wu, the news that the Qin dynasty had taken back Yangshan Commandery and that the Yuan Wu emperor had flattened Deer Mountain with one blow had not reached Chongling. All of Chongling appeared especially heavy as they waited. They were slightly irritated and anxious. Chapter 217. In the late spring, the armies of the Chu, Yan, and Qi dynasties left Deer Mountain like three long dragons and moved into the wilderness behind Deer Mountain. Many of the generals and cultivators of the three dynasties felt exceptionally humiliated. They knew that the three dynasties had come at different times, but had to leave at the same time because it was not safe for any of the armies that came to Deer Mountain to face the Qin army alone. This kind of humiliation was even greater for the Chu generals and officials gathered around the Emperor of Chu's carriage. 9 years ago, they had been the victors against the Qin. But now, the situation had completely reversed. Time and fate, not the fault of war. Fortune and misfortune lie within. Misfortune and fortune depend on each other. No one can say for sure how this calamity has turned. What worried these Chu officials the most was that the Emperor of Chu had burned away the last of his energy at Deer Mountain. Now, even cultivators who were not very strong could feel that his body was like an oil lamp that had used up all of its oil, and only the last red wick was giving off embers. So when the Emperor of Chu said some comforting words to his most trusted officials with a calm expression, they seemed to be his last words in their ears. Yangshan Commandery was theirs to begin with. It is not a big deal to return it to them. It is also not a big deal to give Deer Mountain to Yuanwu to prevent the Qin army from marching in. At most, we need to set up more garrisons around Deer Mountain. Even more important is the people. Knowing that the people around him could not walk out of the Yuanwu emperor's shadow, the Emperor of Chu smiled slightly. After saying this, he only left behind some of the most important officials of the Chu dynasty. I think you know some things from the previous assassination. You know that I favor consort Zhao only because of her beauty. His gaze landed on these important officials whose hair was slightly white. He said gravely, "What I want you to do now is to unconditionally obey all of her decisions, regardless of what she does." Hearing such a vague imperial order, the 4 old officials who knew him very well all held their breaths. "Take this as my last will." But before they could speak, the Emperor of Chu looked at them and said softly, "Since this is my will, you should know how much serious consideration I went through when I said this. So you do not need to doubt or ask. I only need you to remember, no matter how you feel it is wrong, you must listen to me." The 4 old officials understood the weight of this sentence and got off the carriage one after another to kneel and accept the order. The Emperor of Chu bowed slightly. The carriage continued forward. Another young cultivator was summoned to the front of his chariot. Even the old officials that the king of Chu trusted the most only knew that this young cultivator was called Li Yunrui and was the personal guard that had followed the king of Chu in recent years. When this young cultivator came in front of the Emperor of Chu's carriage alone, the bronze sparrow seal scripts on the Emperor of Chu's carriage started to shine. The bronze sparrows seemed to take this bronze carriage into the air and fly to the illusory jade palaces in the sky. Shrouded in the light, this young cultivator's expression was calm and solemn. He knew that the light given off by this bronze carriage was only used to stop anyone from eavesdropping. It could also cause the Emperor of Chu or him to disappear from this place. He knew that there was an extremely important mission waiting for him that might require him to give up his life. He didn't say anything and just waited seriously. Do not let anyone know of today's matter, including Consort Zhao and the future Emperor of Chu. The Emperor of Chu looked warmly and apologetically at him. He spoke first in the flying bronze light. Li Yunrui took a deep breath and nodded to show that he understood. "Go to Chongling now." This time, a Chongling youth entered Wu Mountain with Fu Su. Previously, they followed forefather Zhou. With your abilities, it should not be hard to find out who that person is. The Emperor of Chu looked approvingly at him and said, "Give him the thing I sealed for you before." Previously, when he said that this matter could not even be known to Consort Zhao, Li Yunrui did not show any shock or puzzlement despite knowing the weight. Yet, hearing the words, Li Yunrui frowned slightly and wanted to ask something. But the Emperor of Chu seemed to see what he was thinking. He shook his head and said, "Do not worry. You just have to give that thing to him." Li Yunrui took another deep breath and nodded. "After I die, only you and that Chongling youth will know of this matter." The Emperor of Chu still seemed worried and said slowly and gravely, "You cannot let anyone know of this matter. If possible, do not let anyone discover that you have gone to Chongling." Li Yunrui breathed deeply, but he still felt he could not breathe. He felt his body grow heavy. But in the next moment, countless lights spun around him into the sky. His body flew with the lights into the sky at astounding speed and disappeared from the Emperor of Chu's carriage. The Emperor of Chu looked up slightly at the lights that disappeared with the white clouds. He was silent. He hoped that his guesses and premonitions were correct, and there were no problems. Li Yunrui's body moved through the chaotic primal energies of the universe like a leaf in a hurricane. After a dozen breaths, he landed in the forest where the Chu dynasty troop had long disappeared. There was still a faint light lingering around his body, making his body light and graceful. Moreover, no aura was emitted from his body. He looked in the direction where the Emperor of Chu had returned and knelt down, kowtowing deeply a few times. Tears fell from his eyes. He knew that after this, it would be difficult for him to see this respectable emperor again. Among the Qi dynasty's carriages, there were still 8 large men in chainmail carrying the grave-like black sedan. Inside this large sedan, with Yin jade as the bricks and pearls as the roof, there were still 2 purple-black wooden chairs in the center. The Emperor of Qi was still sitting on one of the purple-black wooden chairs. Sitting in the wooden chair opposite him was Yening, who had changed into a new black robe. Yen Ying's eyes were closed. While his vitality had long disappeared, his expression was normal, as though he was in a deep sleep. Any matter will naturally decline when it reaches its peak. If the fire is too strong, it cannot last. Teacher Ruo, this is the principle you told me before. I truly think of you as my teacher, but you feel that I do not qualify to be your disciple. I can only call you Teacher Ruo. Based on what you told me, Yuanwu's victory today is a good thing? He is so strong that he has subdued the 3 dynasties. He must be at his peak. If not for this, I think that in the future, the 3 dynasties will not be able to work together against the Qin dynasty. We will be defeated one by one. In this case, why is he going to decline after reaching his peak? But without you by my side, I really do not have much confidence. After saying this, the Emperor of Qi looked fawningly at Yening and said seriously, Teacher Ruo, look, I have completely followed your wishes and will bring your body back to your disciple in one piece. You will not suddenly use some method to scare me, right? After saying this, the Emperor of Qi waited silently. After an unknown amount of time, he sighed. Master Ruo, it seems like you've really left me. Without you, I really feel that it's meaningless. His sigh was faint, and it continuously echoed in the black palanquin. The atmosphere of the Yen dynasty's carriages was the most oppressive, because when they left Deer Mountain, the Emperor of Yan's expression was the ugliest and angriest. Even when he entered his imperial carriage, the Emperor of Yan's eyes still burned with unusual anger. No orders were issued from the imperial chariot. All the officials of the Yen dynasty naturally thought that the Emperor of Yan's anger had not dissipated. But unexpectedly, behind the heavy curtains of the imperial carriage, the Emperor of Yen did not have any anger in his eyes. He did not even have much sorrow. Spirit beasts that looked like fish and birds flew in the sky. Ding Ning and Fu Su sat next to each other and watched as the scenery around Deer Mountain and Wu Mountain quickly retreated. All the enemies had left, but the Yuanwu Emperor was still on the peak of Deer Mountain. He stood alone by the cliff, allowing the wind to blow at his dragon robe and hair. At this time, few people would think that the Yuanwu Emperor was waiting for a person to appear. In the mind of the Yuanwu Emperor, there was another person who was the greatest variable. Yet that variable did not appear. He had won, and won completely. He had not appeared when he was most likely to be killed. That person was completely dead. Even if the 9-death silkworm appeared, it may have nothing to do with him. Carrier pigeons and falcons were flying rapidly, and horses were galloping. They sent the results of the Deer Mountain Conference in all directions to the world. Looking at the white clouds in the sky, the Yuanwu Emperor thought coolly, that person should not appear again. Starting today, this world should belong to this lonely one. Chapter 2:18. In the morning, when the smoke had just started to rise, a light wind blew at the curtains. In the Falling Parasol wine shop, Zhang Sun Qianxue had just finished cooking the porridge. Her beautiful and cool brows suddenly furrowed slightly. Then she walked out of the back courtyard towards the front hall. A short while later, the half-closed shop door creaked. Looking at the person who pushed open the door with great familiarity and seemed to have dew on his body, Zhang Sun Qianxue asked, "How come you are so fast?" Her tone was neither cold nor indifferent, but it was extremely rare for her to use such a tone when dealing with people. Only Ding Ning could casually push open the door and make her speak in such a tone. "I came back on Pan Rui's Kuan Beast." Ding Ning picked up a dry cloth to wipe his face and body as he responded. They had not seen each other for a long time, and he was not certain if they would meet again. But at this time, Zhang Sun Qianxue looked at his slightly damp hair and pale face. She did not say more and just asked simply, "How is it?" Ding Ning glanced at her and said, "Li Kaitian is dead, Fang Xiang is crippled, Emperor Qin of Han is dead, Yining is dead, Song Chaosheng is dead, Guidongjiang is dead, Yi Xinhe is still alive but seriously injured. Minister Li has cultivated the yearning sword art. Yuanwu is fine, realmate second class." Zhang Sun Qianxue grew silent. While she was usually too lazy to think about matters outside of cultivation, she was the smartest person. Only she could talk to Ding Ning in such a way, and the two were used to this way of talking. Yi Xinhe deserves to die. She was silent for a long time before she said this. She understood all the people of the Bazin Kendo ground in the past. So while Ding Ning spoke simply, she was certain of something from these simple words. If Yi Xinhe was not one of the Yuanwu Emperor's people, then she would not have been seriously injured, and would have died with those people. Ding Ning put down the half-wet cloth in his hand and glanced at her. Her exquisite face didn't change much, but she was furious. "You don't have to be angry." Ding Ning lowered his head and began to look for shoes to change into. At the same time, he said softly, "There are more than one or two betrayers. I've seen so many that I've become numb. It's not worth getting angry." Zhang Sun Qianxue didn't answer his question. After a moment of silence, she said, "So many people, yet they couldn't kill him." Ding Ning said softly, "It's okay. We can wait." Zhang Sun Qianxue's anger began to show on her face. She felt that Ding Ning's advice was somewhat hypocritical. However, Ding Ning had anticipated her reaction. He raised his head and continued, "Both he and Zheng Xiu know how to play with power, taking advantage of the cultivation practitioners of the Qin dynasty. If we want to kill him, we have to get rid of the people around him first." Chapter 219. In the first light of dawn, a goshawk suddenly folded its wings in the sky and fell down like a meteor. But when it reached a certain height, it suddenly spread its wings and glided at astounding speed, almost sticking to some yellow eaves, into the depths of Chongling's imperial palace. In the natural world, goshawks would rarely fly in such an astounding manner. the imperial palace of the Qin dynasty was also difficult for birds to cross. The cultivators guarding the palace would not allow birds to fly freely in the palace. Yet this goshawk's feathers were slightly red. This was not a normal color in the natural world. All the cultivators in the Qin dynasty's imperial palace knew that this goshawk came from one of the emperor's attendants. In the cabinet, the 4 inner pavilion elders waited excitedly and anxiously. It had been 3 days since the Deer Mountain Conference had ended. In these 3 days, military reports related to the Deer Mountain Conference had been sent into the imperial palace. Adding on the fact that Emo Shoching and Pan Rui had returned to the palace, as elders of the inner pavilion, their status in the cabinet was second only to the 2 ministers. They already knew of the Qin dynasty's glorious victory at the Deer Mountain Conference. But at this time, most people in Chongling did not know of this news and were still waiting for news of the Deer Mountain Conference. But when to announce this news and what to say, they had to wait for the Holy One to decide. What would Chongling become after this news was announced? They also knew that Prime Minister Li had followed the Holy One to Deer Mountain. The Empress and Prime Minister Yan had gone to Yangshan Commandery. They should be on their way back to Chongling. From a certain point of view, Chongling was an empty city right now. The excited and anxious wait finally had a result. Not long after the goshawk flew into the imperial palace, a ceremonial official appeared in front of them with a bright yellow scroll. The 4 elders started to write furiously. Orders came out of the imperial palace. Chants of promises rang out in the dark and gloomy imperial palace. Waves of joyful shouts and cheers sounded. Chongling started to boil. As the astounding news was announced, the pressure that had accumulated in Chongling was swept away. The farmer's hoe hit his foot. The cook's knife cut his finger. The porter on the gangplank fell into the icy river between the boats. Almost all the people of Chongling were distracted. Almost all the people of Chongling put down what they were doing and flooded the streets to shout "Long live the Emperor!" Yangshan Commandery had been taken back by the powerful army of the Qin dynasty. Not only Yangshan Prefecture, but even the Wushan and Deer Mountain regions that connected the Qin and Chu dynasties belonged to the Qin dynasty. This was truly a celebration of the entire nation. "Come closer. I will tell you if I am satisfied today." A teasing voice sounded from the water and reached Shen Xian's ears. Shen Xian's eyebrows rose slightly. He looked up at the person in the water, but did not take a step towards the stepping stone. "You don't even dare to take a step forward. You are worried that you will fall into my trap and want to use this chance to disturb my mind." Lin Zhujiu did not look like a person in the water, but a messy weed growing in the water. But he gave off the feeling of a proud person. He laughed. "Do you not feel this is laughable?" Shen Xian was silent for a moment and said, "It is laughable, but I am on the stone and you are in the water." Lin Zhujiu smiled and said, "That was then, and this is now. Maybe one day you will be in the water, and I will be watching you from above." Shen Xian narrowed his eyes at him and said, "Is that possible?" Lin Zhujiu nodded seriously and said, "It should be soon." Shen Xian's pupils contracted slightly, and he did not speak. Only prisoners are intimidated by prison officers, but I have never heard of a prison officer being intimidated by a prisoner. Lin Zhujiu laughed again. "But I am in a good mood today and can tell you some things." Shen Xian looked with an ugly expression at Lin Zhujiu. He had been in the great floating water prison for so many years and knew Lin Zhujiu well. Of course, he did not think that Lin Zhujiu would tell him anything useful. But Lin Zhujiu said, "Li Lingjuan's establishment is finished." Shen Xian's breathing suddenly stopped, and an unusual light shot out of his eyes. "If we send troops to protect Li Lingjuan's establishment now. There may be time. Otherwise, today, Li Lingjuan's establishment will completely disappear from Chongling. Lin Zhujiu said slowly, no matter what kind of victory Yuan Wu obtained at Deer Mountain, the Chu hostage establishment cannot be destroyed so easily. We have just made an alliance and naturally have to give face to the 3 dynasties. Shen Xian's eyes narrowed into slits. He said coldly, who would destroy Li Lingjuan's establishment at this time? Lin Zhujiu moved slightly and glanced at Shen Xian. He said, Yangshan Commandery is not just humiliation to most people in Chongling, but also bone-deep hatred. You should not forget that the Qin dynasty soldiers who died in that battle mostly came from Chongling and Guangzhou. Victory brings venting. After a pause, Lin Zhujiu said in a mocking tone, when you feel you may not be as strong as your opponent, you will control your venting. But when you feel your opponent has been defeated, this kind of venting will often go out of control. Shen Xian thought carefully about the words. His back grew colder, but he still shook his head. This has nothing to do with my duty. How is it unrelated? Lin Zhujiu's voice was full of mockery. From the start, you were led astray by me. You were led by me and heard me say that the Li Lingjun establishment would be destroyed. You never thought that I was imprisoned here before the Li Lingjun establishment. I may not even know of the Chu hostage, so how could I know of the Li Lingjun establishment? Shen Xian's body shook, and his face paled. In these years, other than a few people, no one could see Lin Zhujiu. When those people were present, he was present. He could not have mentioned Li Lingjun. How did he know? I know how to read minds. With the sound of water, Lin Zhujiu looked up, his tangled hair creating splashes of water. I can see from people's eyes what they are hiding in their hearts. I see that you are the same. So this is the secret of my invincibility in the past, my ability to predict the enemy's moves, and what people are thinking. Shen Xian sank into great shock, but many breaths later, he was furious. How can there be mind reading in the world? You want to attack my mind. You think that I will be affected by your words. His furious voice echoed in the water prison. Lin Zhujiu just looked at him and smiled slightly. He said, mind reading does not exist, but you think you will have a good ending? You think that everything is in Yuan Wu's control as he thinks? Just like in the past, Shen Xian felt inexplicable terror. Some of Lin Zhujiu's words were absurd, but sometimes he just admitted it was absurd. But the following words were like cold needles that pierced the heart. Even more importantly, in the past many years, many of the things Lin Zhujiu said became reality. Just like in the past, Shen Xian decisively turned and left the cell without another word. Chapter 220. The country could not be without a ruler for a day. The imperial palace could not be without a ruler for a day. Any imperial procession would usually return as quickly as possible when they returned to court. Idling and looking at the flowers was something idle people did. Monarchs were never idle, yet the imperial procession of the Chu dynasty stopped at Wan City. Wan City had originally belonged to the Han dynasty. When the Han dynasty had been destroyed, the Chu dynasty had carved up a piece of land. Wan City and Deer Mountain were only separated by a few cities, less than 100 miles away. Naturally, it was a border city and not an important city where soldiers and food were stored. It was not a wise thing to stay in a place like this. Yet, almost everyone in the imperial procession knew the reason. The king of Chu was truly at the end of his rope. Many people knew that this emperor who had been on the throne for the longest time had problems with his body. As the Deer Mountain Conference started, as the primal energies of the universe vibrated violently at Deer Mountain, and as multiple grandmasters died, His energy seemed to have been completely used up, and the illness in his body erupted. The king of Chu did not have a good reputation outside. He was lustful, mediocre, and did not like court. But the old officials who had followed him for many years knew that his low profile and peace, and even his muddle-headedness, were just his methods. He did not see and did not care. Most of the time, he was just being tolerant and letting go. So no one in the Chu dynasty looked down on him, and not many people opposed him. They could criticize him, they could despise him, but they also respected him. The palace in one city had been built long before the king of Chu had come. On the dragon bed in the palace, the king of Chu leaned back on the couch. His gaze wanted to focus, but it was slightly unfocused. So his expression was calm, but he could not help but feel helpless and emotional. Consort Zhao looked down at him and held his hands. "I thought that you could at least last until we reached the imperial city." She slowly said, "I had not expected it to be so fast." The king of Chu felt the softness and warmth of her hands and smiled slightly. He said, "I had not expected it to be so fast either. Who would have thought that I would encounter Mo Shocheng at Goddess Peak?" Consort Zhao was silent. Her hands started to tighten slightly, and her knuckles started to light up. "Don't do that." The Emperor of Chu shook his head. Consort Zhao shook her head stubbornly. She looked at him and said, "It doesn't matter if you die on the way to war, but if you die on the way back from Deer Mountain, it will be too bad for your reputation. I don't want to hear future generations say that you were scared out of your wits by the Yuanwu Emperor and that your old illness flared up and you died before you could reach the capital. Although our reputations have never been good, I don't want you to leave with such a reputation. This is not important." The king of Chu shook his head again. He looked at her and said, "I only want you to endure." "Wait." Consort Zhao did not understand what he meant. The king of Chu nodded. "In the future, you only need to endure. You do not need to do anything. You only need to endure. Even if you suffer a great loss, you will endure." Consort Zhao still did not understand. She asked, "Why?" "Because this will allow the Chu to exist longer than the Yen and Qi." The king of Chu smiled and said, "Maybe we can endure until the death of the Qin dynasty." Consort Zhao looked at him. She wanted to say something, but she sensed something. Her soft hands grew stiff. The king of Chu smiled tiredly and said, "No matter what kind of person you become in the eyes of the Chu people and the historians, I am very reassured in giving the Chu to you." After saying this, he slowly closed his eyes like he was falling into a deep sleep. Consort Zhao held his hand and looked at him for a long time. She said, "Your Majesty, do not worry. I will do well." Then she stood up, turned, and walked out. "His Majesty has died." Her voice rang out in the cold, temporary imperial residence, and then turned into another clap of thunder in the late spring. "His Majesty has died." Orders and sorrowful cries sounded. Her figure was frozen like a statue under the eaves of the palace. Her face was like jade, but there was no sorrow. It was not that she was not sorrowful, but for many people, there was no time in life for sorrow. The king of Chu died on the way. For Chongling, in the late spring of the 12th year of Yuanwu, when the news spread through the streets, the noblest mistress of Chongling returned to Chongling, to her inner palace. When her figure appeared on the stone path lined with terracotta soldiers, Fu Su was already waiting on the stone path. Looking at Fu Su, who was happily bowing, her perfect eyes had a doting expression that quickly turned to absolute calm. "You cannot attend the Min Mountain Sword trials again." She looked at Fu Su and said. Fu Su's body shook slightly, his face paling. He asked, "Mother Empress, why?" "I know that friendship is very important to you. I also know that I promised you that you would attend the Min Mountain Sword Trials. The Empress looked gently at him and said, I allowed you to attend the Min Mountain Sword Trials so that you could walk freely outside the palace. But your status is different. Fu Su was stunned. Because there are no accidents at the Deer Mountain Conference, the Empress looked up into the distance of Chongling and said softly, So you will quickly become the crown prince. It is nothing for an imperial son to walk outside, but a newly appointed crown prince cannot. It is not proper for the crown prince to attend a sword trial like this. Also, I cannot give you much time to play. You have many things to learn, many things to do. I think you understand. Hearing these words, Fu Su's head hung down. He understood these truths, but he could not help but feel sad. I know you are sad, but as long as that wine shop youth is outstanding enough, you will have a chance to interact. The Empress seemed to see what he was thinking. Her voice was much gentler. That youth performed well at Wu Mountain. I am very satisfied and will naturally reward him greatly. Hearing her words, Fu Su's eyes suddenly lit up. He became happy for his good friend's encounter. Thank you, Mother Empress. In his view, since she spoke of great reward, the reward would naturally be great. A great reward might ensure that Ding Ning could successfully pass the Min Mountain Sword Trials and enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to cultivate, but he did not know that a person had many aspects. A noble mistress of Chongling, like her, would usually handle matters in many different aspects, but the reward was only one aspect of it. They are so extravagant. Even a window frame is carved with so many flowers. But firewood is more suitable than the door. It saves effort. This is iron birch wood. It is not so easy to chop it. A man in rough robes, holding a chopping blade, looked in puzzlement at the wooden window frame that only had a few marks on it. He looked up and said in disbelief to Ding Ning, who had warned him, How can this would be so hard? It will sink if you throw it into water. Of course it is hard. Ding Ning smiled slightly and said, If you want to chop it to use as firewood, you have to find a large axe. I fear you will have to chop it until tomorrow morning. Bah! Even a window frame is so exquisite. How much effort would it take to carve such patterns on such hardwood? How much silver would be wasted on so many gaudy things? The man in rough robes spat and shoved his weapon into his belt. He did not want to waste any energy on this window frame. At the same time, he said disdainfully, No wonder the Chu dynasty took advantage of us so much, and after 9 years, they could not defeat us and gave us a large piece of land. Ding Ning smiled and did not speak. He followed the man's gaze and saw a courtyard. This courtyard took up an enormous amount of space and had many buildings. It had originally been beautiful, but at a glance, the roof tiles were broken. The buildings inside had been torn down, and even the high walls were stained and had many large holes. Shen Yi was next to Ding Ning. Looking at the ruined scene in the courtyard through the large holes in the wall, Shen Yi could not help but sigh. I had not expected Li Lingjuan's establishment to become like this in just a few days. No one knew of the conversation in the deepest part of the great floating water prison. Yet everything was as the strongest strategist in the history of the Qin dynasty had said. When the carnival atmosphere spread through the streets of Chongling, many people could not help but think of hatred. At the start, many Chongling people who had lost family in the battle with the Chu just threw whatever they could grab at the walls of Li Lingjuan's establishment. But as more and more people gathered, this kind of anger could not be controlled and turned into a wild tide. On the first day, the walls and gates of the courtyard were broken down, and many valuable items were looted. On the second day, some furniture and decorations were taken. On the third day, even the precious plants and some useful wood had been taken away. Starting from the night of the third day, even some stone and pillars were pulled down with ropes and dragged away. At this time, the scattered objects of Li Lingjuan's establishment could be seen in many of the streets of Chongling. Li Lingjuan's establishment, which had once been a legend in Chongling, had turned to ruins in these few days. On the first day, when Li Lingjuan's establishment had changed, Ding Ning had gone to the scene to watch. Just as he had expected, the people who had stayed behind to guard Li Lingjuan's establishment had taken away or destroyed everything of value to cultivators or the court when they saw the situation could not be controlled. The only thing he could do was to see if there was anything left behind that would be of value to him, a clue that could help him obtain some information. For the enormous Li Lingjuan's establishment, a few days was not enough to get clues from the details. Like many Chongling people who were exceptionally satisfied every time they entered the ruined Li Lingjuan's establishment, Ding Ning once again entered Li Lingjuan's establishment. The poor man with a hatchet at his belt strolled contentedly in the unattended Li Lingjuan's establishment. Ding Ning and Shen Yi, who had followed him into Li Lingjuan's establishment through a hole in the wall, walked towards a half-collapsed building. At this time, Li Yunrui was walking into Li Lingjuan's establishment from another direction. Chapter 221. Senior Sect Brother, what are you searching for? Shen Yi asked softly as he looked at Ding Ning, who was squatting down and looking closely at the marks between the tiles. He was even sniffing some scents. After the Garden of Zhou, he knew that his senior sect brother, who came from the streets, could not be judged by common sense. Maybe he had entered Li Lingjuan's establishment to search for clues related to cultivation. The Min Mountain Sword trials were near. In his view, everything Ding Ning did was for the Min Mountain Sword trials. Yet after walking in Li Lingjuan's establishment for several days and staying for a long time each day, Shen Yi increasingly felt that Ding Ning's actions had nothing to do with cultivation, especially when Ding Ning's actions seemed to be investigating a case. Ding Ning's brow was deeply furrowed. He did not immediately answer Shen Yi's question. He rubbed some dust on his fingers and then stood up from the broken tiles. He looked at Shen Yi and said, "Your family is one of the wealthiest families in Guangzhou. You should know more about the expenses of such an establishment than I do. In these days, you have followed me to look at Li Lingjuan's establishment many times. How much do you think such an establishment, with so many retainers, will cost?" Shen Yi stilled and said, "Based on the structure of the buildings and so many people, the expenses are too great. I need to calculate carefully to estimate. Senior sect brother, why are you asking this?" Ding Ning still did not answer his question and said, "Li Lingjun came to Chongling as a hostage in the 3rd year of Yuanwu. This Li Lingjun establishment has been expanding intermittently for 9 years, but in the end, it has become like this." Senior sect brother, you mean that Li Lingjuan's wealth came too strangely? Shen Yi finally realized there were many more mansions in Chongling that were more luxurious than Li Lingjuan's establishment. But those mansions had been built over many years, or the people who built those mansions had been in Chongling for many years before they built them. However, if the previously intact Li Lingjun residence was completely converted into gold and silver and piled up in front of him, then this gold and silver had all appeared in the past few years. Thinking about the items from Li Lingjun residence that he had seen in the streets and alleys these days, although they weren't considered luxurious, the materials used were extremely exquisite and luxurious. Shen Yi couldn't help but think of the previously intact Li Lingjun residence. If it was converted into a pile of gold and silver in front of him, then it would be an astonishing mountain of gold and silver. Previously, most people in Chongling had never entered the Chu hostage establishment. Even if they did, they could not see it deeply. But now they see it clearly. When the Lu family was destroyed, while an astounding fortune was seized, the legendary treasury was not found. Ding Ning looked at Shen Yi and nodded. Shen Yi swallowed hard and murmured, "It is because of the support of the Liu family. But, senior sect brother, you spent so much effort just to find Li Lingjuan's supporters?" Ding Ning was silent for a moment and said, "This will be of great importance in the future." Shen Yi could not understand. In his view, even if the Liu family and Li Lingjun were in cahoots, Li Lingjun had returned to the Chu dynasty. In the future, when Li Lingjun became the emperor of the Chu dynasty, even if there was a connection, it was related to the Holy One and those marquises. What did it have to do with Ding Ning? "Someone is coming." Ding Ning did not explain. He turned around and looked behind him. Shen Yi did not care at first. This Li Lingjun establishment seemed to have become a storehouse for the surrounding families. Countless people came in and out every day. He could imagine that in the future, many houses, and even the walls of Changling, would have wood and stone from Li Lingjun. Yet when his gaze followed Ding Ning's gaze, his body unconsciously shook. He saw a young person. This young man's clothes and body looked abnormally clean, but he gave him the feeling that he was travel-worn. Also, he was certain that this young person was a cultivator, and one many times stronger than him and Ding Ning. Also, this young person's expression was exceptionally calm and solemn. Seeing Ding Ning and Shen Yi look at him, this young person bowed deeply to Ding Ning, but did not speak. Ding Ning's eyebrows rose slightly. He had seen many such solemn expressions, so he immediately sensed the special meaning from this young person. "You know me?" He looked at the young person and asked. The young person slowly stood up and said respectfully, "Ding Ning of White Goat Cave." Ding Ning looked at him and asked, "What business do you have with me?" The young person said respectfully, "I have been entrusted by someone. Can I speak with you alone?" Ding Ning frowned slightly, but did not speak. He nodded simply and said, "All right." Then he walked towards a secluded and ruined building. This young person was naturally Li Yunrui. Seeing Ding Ning's presence, his eyes flashed with an unusual light. The moment he followed Ding Ning into the deserted building, he took out an item from his sleeve and handed it to Ding Ning. Ding Ning's frown deepened. He looked at a square object about a foot long wrapped in ordinary cloth in Li Yunrui's hand. He asked, "What is this?" Li Yunrui looked at the clean and serious features of this Chongling marketplace youth. He shook his head and said, "I do not know what this is. I just want to give this item to you. Also, only you and I know this in the world. Only I know that this item is in your hands." Ding Ning thought for a moment. He did not immediately take the item from Li Yunrui's hand. His perception gently permeated the texture of the cloth and landed on the item inside. In the next moment, his gaze grew even more serious. "You also do not know what is inside." He raised his head, looked at Li Yunrui, and asked this seriously. Li Yunrui shook his head. "All right." Ding Ning nodded. He took the item wrapped in the cloth and held it in his hand. Li Yunrui bowed deeply. Without another word, she turned and left. Ding Ning looked at the back of this young person. True respect appeared in his eyes. He knew this young person came from the Chu. He also knew that he would not be able to see this young person from the Chu in the future. Li Yunrui walked out of Li Lingjuan's establishment and then slowly walked along the secluded streets towards the Wei River. On the banks of the Wei River, he looked in the direction of Deer Mountain and the Chu. Then he calmly stepped into the slightly cool river water. When the river water drowned his body, he slowly and gently released all of his vital energy and primal energies of the universe. Then he thought of the spring flowers blooming in the alleys of the Chu City and closed his eyes, sinking into the darkness. You're tuning into the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.